Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my, at this time, yet to be named, YouTube channel. This has been a long time coming. I've wanted to write down my life testimony for my own sake, to make sure I don't forget really important things that happened to me that led me to where I am today, both in my life, but most importantly, with regard to my faith, what I believe, who I am. So, another reason I'm doing this is because, as anyone who knows me is aware, most of my free time, outside of working a full-time job, trying to be a husband and a father to 6, soon to be 7 beautiful, precious gifts that are my children, and being involved as a reader in the church, is spent dialoguing with people about the Holy Orthodox faith. I talk to all kinds of people from various backgrounds, different Christian traditions, even atheists, agnostics, but mostly lately, my efforts have been honed in on what we would call heterodox Christians, which is Christians who are not Orthodox and don't really understand why they should be Orthodox yet. So when I'm talking to these people, they, for good reason, kind of want to know who they're talking to. Fair. Otherwise, there's a danger that they may feel like my journey was disingenuous, potentially, or that I don't understand where they're coming from. So rather than, in the cases where someone asks, how did you become Orthodox? How were you raised faith-wise? What led you to this point? What led you to reevaluate things at this juncture? Instead of just giving bits and pieces over and over and over again, or trying to summarize my entire life's journey in a span of, a half-hour voice message, missing this important thing and that important thing because I'm tired and I'm distracted. It was high time to take the time to sit down and prepare my life testimony. And I'm doing it for myself, as I said. I'm doing it for those inquirers who want to get to know the person who they're engaging with. And I'm also doing it, it's become something I'm also doing for my children and for their sake, because they will never know face to face the person who I was before I became a Christian, and obviously before I became an Orthodox Christian. So when the time comes that it's appropriate that they learn my journey of faith and all of its twists and turns and ups and downs, it will be important for them to know that I didn't just inherit this faith, that I didn't just blindly believe it because it was told to me, that I had a real authentic experience of God, that I questioned things, and that ultimately the reason that I'm Orthodox is because I actually believe it, and because it makes sense to me, and because I've messed up enough in my life to see the problems, both intellectually and experientially, with not being a Christian at all, as well as not being Orthodox. So that's kind of a quick summary as to why I'm doing this. And my goal is to create more content pertaining to why become Orthodox in the future. I have all kinds of ideas floating around in my head that I've been kind of preparing for years now. But this is an important one. And so now when people ask me, I can send them a link to this video. And if they care, they can watch it. Let me also state very clearly right out of the gate, I'm not under the delusion that my life is that important and that a lot of people are going to sit through this video. There's going to be a lot in this video. I really didn't want to leave any stone unturned. So at the risk of being self-indulgent or narcissistic, bear with me, because I'm only sharing all these details so that in case there's something someone can cling to that they relate with, they catch that and it's not overlooked. So I have to put this out there right from the get-go, there are going to be some things that I share in this video that inevitably upset some people. Know for certain that that's not my intention. My intention is to faithfully communicate my experiences, my thoughts, and how they led to my ultimate conclusions. There are certain things that you don't have to agree with me about that I came to believe on this path that I will be sharing. You don't necessarily have to agree with me in order to be an Orthodox Christian, at least not entirely agree. Other things, I would argue, are probably more critical. I'm not here to parse out which things are and which things are not necessary. These aren't all matters of faith even, or especially dogma. I'm just here to explain how things made sense in my mind. But there are certain things that do directly affect our Christian faith, and all I can do is be honest about how they affected me. If that can help people who relate on those issues, glory to God. So forgive me, a sinner, if anything that I present here ends up offending you. Shall we begin? My name is Paul Trinka, or as my Christian church friends call me, Reader Paul. I was raised Roman Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic, in a big, large Italian family. My immediate family, I was only one of 3 children. Younger brother, Alan, 2 years younger than me, and my younger sister, Natalie, who's 6 years younger than me. But I had dozens of first cousins, many of whom were very close with us and who we hung out with all the time. So it was a very close-knit family. Big Italian family, Roman Catholics, practicing, almost all of them. My parents, in particular, raised us in the church. So I'll never be able to do my parents justice in the next several seconds of summarizing my childhood, but suffice it to say that my siblings and I are well aware of and have often acknowledged how we have been gifted the most incredible childhood that anyone could ever ask for. We had loving parents who were dedicated to one another, who raised us in the faith that they knew best, however imperfect that was from my perspective now being Orthodox. And, they raised us in the church. My mother stayed home with us to give us her full attention as my dad diligently worked to provide for our family. And all I have is incredible memories from my childhood. That's all there is to say. God couldn't have graced us with better parents. And they were faithful. I altar served regularly for years, played piano at church, read at church. I was very involved for the entire time that I was a young child, all the way up through 8th grade. I went to that Catholic school that was associated with our home parish. I also went to a college preparatory Catholic school called St. Francis High School, and I played football there for 4 years, was in a musical, and was just involved with all kinds of other stuff. If you would have asked me when I was growing up in my early 20s what are 2 things that defined who I am, those 2 things would have been music and football, just to give you an idea of where my focuses started shifting to as I began growing into myself. So here I want to get into a little bit of my faith life and how things transpired and where things went wrong. So as I approached my high school graduation, the strong moral formation I'd received from my parents, which had more or less sustained me throughout high school, began to rapidly erode. I really didn't start swearing until halfway through high school. I never did any drugs. By the time I graduated, I had only drank alcohol a single time, and that time I was by myself in my own home, not out at a party or something. So while I'm not attempting to trivialize that sin, I'm just trying to paint the picture that compared to the moral state of a lot of youth by this point in their lives, especially today, I like to think my moral foundation really served me well to prevent me from falling into some of the biggest sinful pitfalls that are out there. But the biggest trigger for the downward spiral, morally speaking, in my life at this time was definitely the budding pornography addiction that reared its ugly head at the end of 8th grade. And, by the time I was in college, had blossomed into a full-blown abject slavery. In retrospect, this particular vice would prove to be the means by which my spiritual life would be ravaged until whatever imperfect faith I had in Christ was completely destroyed. It was also a vice that was stimulated and fostered by secular mainstream music, which promoted every vice imaginable and pumped out videos that were absolutely akin to softcore pornography. And I most certainly abused them as such in my younger days. There is one poignant moment that I will never forget in the midst of this rapidly developing addiction. I was a freshman in high school, and I was in my living room waiting for some of my friends to come over. It was Christmas time, so my parents had a beautiful tree up in the living room. As a child, my siblings and I, often with my parents present, would spend many mornings and evenings gathered around the tree watching the train go around, sometimes making hot chocolate or popcorn just for that purpose alone. Christmas time was filled with so many blessed memories with my family, and those memories were being called to mind in this moment that I'm describing for you. This time, however, rather than comfort and peace, the memories were cause for great sorrow and hopelessness. Never before had I been so acutely aware of the fact that my innocence was long gone. I sat on the couch in the presence of both the Christmas tree and the computer that had facilitated so many perverse thoughts and evil actions, lamenting the fact that I could never go back and reclaim that innocence. To that point in time, I always innately knew that what I was doing was gravely wrong. However, as I continued to sear my conscience over time, this awareness became more and more distant until it would disappear completely, only to faintly pop up on rare occasions. What made this moment, though, especially unique is that it was also the first time that I began to confront the reality that I did not possess the willpower to stop. See, at this point in my life, I was still a practicing Roman Catholic, and I was routinely confessing, mainly because of this sin. It was like I was living a dual life, though, because I wasn't even really ever trying to stop. But I knew it was wrong, so I kept going to confession. Naturally, when someone is living a dual life, they like to keep their secret hypocrisy hidden in as much as is possible. So in a bizarre manifestation of irony, I began actively avoiding the magnified shame and guilt of my unrepentant sin by going to different priests for confession at local churches all around me. One week it would be the friar at my high school. Another week it would be with a new priest at the church down the road from me. Another week I'd ride my bike to a different church. And another week I'd go to the church that I was raised in. Though not every week, this cycle of bouncing around continued for a very long time until I moved out and went to college, really. Eventually, I kind of just came to terms with the fact that I wasn't really even making any efforts to stop this particular sin. So if Jesus was real in my mind at that point, which I was no longer sure of, I was just abusing the sacrament anyway. I would honestly imagine his disgust with me during my insincere confessions. By my sophomore year of college, I had stopped attending Mass altogether. The tempting lure of alcohol and women in an unrestrained setting on a college campus proved to be a strong incentive to cease pursuing any lingering concerns I might have had for these higher questions. Now, one of the other major issues that played a role in planting seeds which directly led to the destruction of my faith was the science of evolutionary biology. While my Catholic grammar school taught evolution side by side with creation and not as a fact, my high school earth science and biology courses plainly taught the idea that the Earth was millions of years old and that Darwinian evolution was true, just a fact of reality. I'll never forget doing the Darwin's Finch experiment in biology class in high school. In reality, that experiment did prove that there can be great diversity in genetic variation within a kind of animal, so to speak. But it did nothing to prove the broader premise of macroevolution. Thus, by the end of my high school career, I was completely brainwashed into believing that macroevolution and the old Earth were both scientific facts. Now, just to highlight how deeply these Catholic institutions had me brainwashed on these subjects, I recall a time when I was visiting St. Luke's Mission on the east side of Buffalo, just to help, as we did every so often, with a meal in their soup kitchen where my aunt is a missionary. There was a man named Eddie there that day, a really zealous Catholic, who ended up being at my table when we took a break to eat. Somehow we got into a discussion about creationism, and all I remember is getting into a legitimate argument with this stranger where our voices were raising over one another. He was trying to convince me that Adam and Eve were real people. How nuts. And that the earth was created in 7 days, just as described in the book of Genesis. I was radically opposed to this idea, and right or wrong, I was convinced that the facts that I was taught in school concerning evolution proved this to be a cartoonish children's fantasy that he was peddling to me. But think about that for a second. I couldn't have barely articulated the first thing about scientific evidence for or against Darwinian evolution at that point in my life. I never even liked science. I didn't pay that much attention in class. Yet, there I was, passionately arguing with a complete stranger because I was convinced that it was true and Genesis was a mythological fairy tale. This was a case of textbook brainwashing. There's no other way to put it. And I wouldn't realize until years later how much of a direct role embracing this science, falsely so-called, played in undermining and uprooting my young faith. I remember one evening playing piano in the empty Catholic church of my youth. The doors used to be open most of the time, and I was welcome to pop in and play as it was fun to hear the acoustics of the building. This particular night, my parish priest from childhood came into the church and sat and talked with me. I asked him questions about evolution and told him how I believed it was true. Now, rather than exhort me to reconsider or even explain how to try and reconcile that with Christianity, he candidly shared his own struggles with believing certain things taught by the church. And I remember sincerely pitying him in that moment, considering his vocation and what he's bound to believe, or at least teach other people. While I appreciated his honesty at the time, this interaction left me with more questions and doubt than when I walked into the door. Now, with all that said, I want to make sure to note that I had many incredible experiences in my 12 years of Catholic school and education. Despite unfortunately playing a role in destroying my immature faith, my high school education especially also gave me the tools that I would eventually use to pursue the truths that led me back to Christ in the long run. English gave me my love for reading and writing, and football gave me the discipline and mental, physical toughness to work hard and never give up. In general, I was just taught well how to critically think and persevere in life. And those kind of intangibles are priceless. I ended up going to college at the University at Buffalo as a media studies major with a concentration on video production. I lived at home for my freshman year, but by my sophomore year, I moved into an off-campus apartment with 5 of my new friends, all members of the a cappella group that I had recently joined, the Buffalo Chips. During this period, I was working basically full-time as a part-time manager intern at a renowned East Coast grocery retailer, on top of being a full-time student. The Chips also had routine practice and regular gigs, both on campus and off, as well as traveling for international competitions every year. As you can imagine, I was incredibly busy all of the time. Whatever free time I did have was dedicated to making music, playing pickup football, and partying. While I was accomplishing things by worldly standards, my life and pursuits for this sustained amount of time were ultimately incredibly vain and shallow. The tides of the secular world have a way of funneling the undiscerning masses into this way of thinking, away from any thought of contemplating deeper spiritual meanings to life. I was no exception. Now, at this point, I was routinely committing sexual sins with women and drinking to the point of absolute obliteration on a regular basis. I was known for my sense of humor, which was not only dark, but shockingly perverse and purposefully so. I had an extremely foul mouth. My hidden pornography addiction was increasingly warping my view of sexuality and women, desensitizing me and driving me deeper into the abyss of insatiable lust and instant pleasure seeking that would leave me satisfied for a moment, but always starving for more. I influenced many people to sin gravely during that time of my life in many ways, and I'm deeply ashamed of that. I participated in and perpetuated the culture that leads men to corrupt and destroy young women and leads women to offer themselves up for that destruction. Even though my intentions were almost always to date and sincerely find a wife, I deceived myself into thinking that this intention justified my behavior in those relationships when, in retrospect, it most certainly did not. One thing that started happening during these years was that I would occasionally have what I could only describe as a panic attack while laying in bed at night. On these occasions, I would be contemplating death and would get a moment of hyper clarity, which would lead to visceral fear of the unknown and the thought of eternity. It was so disconcerting that I eventually stopped laying on my stomach at night because the feeling of my heart beating reminded me of my mortality and would evoke this kind of fearful contemplation. I even made a song about this on my EP from that time. It was called Drowning in the Dark. The chorus was, "When I lie in darkness, I am drowned." Still up on YouTube if anyone wants to get a really personal window into these experiences that I was having. Anyway, this confronting of the reality of death definitely innately inspired a fear and dread that seems both unreasonable and somewhat unnatural if I had equal reason to be hopeful rather than concerned according to my secular worldview at the time. Like, I mean, if it's just a toss-up, I mean, if the afterlife isn't this big scary thing necessarily, if Christianity is false, and why am I so scared? It's almost like there was something deep down that knew that my soul was not prepared for what we're all going to face. Unsurprisingly, it was also during this period of hedonistic pleasure seeking that I started having encounters with the demonic realm. I was getting into spirit science and was learning about astral projection, which is cunningly portrayed as the gateway to living out every fantasy and adventure that you could imagine while lucid dreaming. Now, while some people get hooked by the thought of flying or doing other kinds of wild activities, you'll find on any relevant forum that the attention, at least of males, quickly shifts to the astral realm as an outlet for carrying out sexual fantasies. This is not a good thing for anyone to pursue, but especially not a porn-addicted young man with insatiable lust. It very obviously, in retrospect, became an invitation for demons, often known as an incubus or succubus, to entice me and eventually terrify and assault me in my sleep. The first instance happened when I moved back with my parents for a few months back in 2010. I was sleeping in my own bedroom and I had a dream that I was laying with a woman and we were being extremely intimate. I didn't know who she was or anything, and we were seemingly preparing to fornicate in this dream. At some point, the woman rolled over for a moment, and when she rolled back to look at me, we were face to face. It was at this moment that this strange woman that I was leaning in to kiss morphed into the most vivid, detailed, and horrifying demon that words cannot sufficiently describe. Think of like the best makeup job of the scariest demon you've ever seen on film and multiply that evil by 10. It was utterly grotesque and supremely frightening. I immediately woke up from that dream, but unlike other nightmares in the past, there was no sudden relief that like, oh, I'm awake now, everything's okay. No, this time there was a deep feeling of dread and fear, as if something was legitimately in the room with me. Over the next several minutes, I managed to collect myself and fall back asleep. But I vividly remembered the dream when I woke up the next morning. So it was either the very next day or one of the days following that. I can't remember exactly, but I went to bed and had essentially the exact same dream. I was once again lying in bed with a strange woman, being extremely intimate. However, this time the dream progressed to the point where we were just about as physically close to consummating that fornicating act when at that time she morphed again and revealed her true form. Once again, I immediately woke up and was very afraid. Never before in my life had I even had a recurring dream, and I had that same feeling of imminent dread as if there was something dark present in the room with me. Unfortunately, at that time, I had no real spiritual grounding or understanding of the demonic realm, so all I could really do was try and calm myself down and go back to sleep. Little did I know that these were telltale signs of an encounter with succubi, which are essentially, again, demons that entice you to sin in your sleep by sexually engaging or abusing you, and often revealing themselves at some point during that process to laugh you to scorn or scare you, as they did me. Sometime after that, while I was still living home, my mother and I got into a very heated argument, which wasn't uncommon at the time. We butted heads for many years since high school. Most of it was my fault. And, of course, we love each other to death. I ended up leaving that shouting match in a fit of obstinate anger and asked my cousin if I could go stay at his house nearby for the night. He was more than happy to let me stay on his couch in the living room. So that night, as I laid down to sleep, at some point, while I was fully conscious there in the dark, I felt something pressing down on my upper chest, pressing me right into the couch with a steady and increasingly great force. I couldn't move, nor could I call out for help. I just struggled to breathe as breathing became more difficult. I was right about at that point where I was about to legitimately pass out when the pressure suddenly released out of nowhere and the experience ceased. It was at this point that I began to strongly reconsider my thoughts on the unseen realm, and I was especially convinced that it most definitely did exist at that point. This experience also showed me that whatever was assaulting me at my parents' house had followed me to my cousins. In other words, this was a me problem, not a room or a house problem. That, too, was very disconcerting. Like many things in life, though, as you get back to the light of day and the swing of your busy routine, these experiences tend to fade into the distance and lose their impact on your perception. It wasn't until I was living with a different cousin in 2011 that the scariest encounter with the demonic realm took place in my life. This was also when I was at the lowest point of my shameful sexual addiction. By this time, whatever conscience I had remaining over the years pertaining to sexual sin was completely seared. I even sunk so pathetically low as to peruse websites for local people explicitly seeking sexual encounters with no strings attached. By God's grace, I at least never followed through with that intention, but that should paint the picture of how depraved my mind and heart was at that time. The evil images that I was devouring with my eyes and absorbing into my heart were getting progressively and necessarily more perverse and unspeakable as, my depart from me, ye who work iniquity, as I became increasingly desensitized. I was also beginning to drink by myself at night, so to put it lightly, I was in a very dark state. The weird irony that must be mentioned here, though, is that I presented myself extremely well to the world around me, as I was always a very socially well-adjusted person. So I was a high-functioning member of society, now working a good full-time management job at a Fortune 500 top 10 company to work for, running a large store at night with many employees, by the age of 23. I was putting out my own music, going out with friends like always, pursuing different video projects, and maintaining normal relationships with people around me. Yet, on the inside, when the lights turned off and I was alone, my thoughts and intentions were dark, depressed, and driven by bestial urges, truly. Thus, at this low point, I went to bed one night and I was laying on my stomach. Those night terrors of the past were kind of over with by this point, and I was just about to fall asleep when all of a sudden I felt my bed shake a bit. Now, I had one of those mattresses that was on a pop-up steel frame, so it would move that way anytime my cat Chip ever jumped on the bed while I was in it. Just kind of like a gentle little... Since I was used to him jumping on the bed to sleep with me, I didn't think anything of it when I felt this. Nor did I think anything of it when I felt him walking gently up the back of my legs onto my lower back. Only thing is, when I turned around to greet him, he wasn't there. Nothing was there. Now, initially, while I was confused, I just figured that maybe I was half asleep and imagined feeling the bed move or something. Or perhaps I turned around so slowly because I was groggy that he jumped down without me even noticing or something. So I lay back on my stomach. Within a few minutes, this time I was most certainly wide awake. The bed gently shook again. Now, I was absolutely positive that Chip must be on my bed. What else could it have been? As I was contemplating this, I felt the footsteps up my leg again, just as the first time. So I quickly turned around once it got to my back, and like the first time, there was nothing there. Now I was actually scared. I knew without a doubt what I had felt. And the fact that it happened again confirmed that I did feel it the first time. It wasn't that I was imagining it. So I sat up in my bed trying to rationalize the situation away, but Chip was nowhere to be found in my small room. All I could do at this point was try to convince myself that I must be overtired or delirious somehow. So after a short time, I calmed myself down and resolved myself to try to go back to sleep, assuring myself that there was nothing to be scared of. I mean, I'm an adult, right? Like, I'm going to be scared of the dark in my bedroom. Then, yet again, like clockwork, as I was just about to fall asleep, the bed shook. Something otherworldly had most certainly just jumped onto my bed and was walking up my body. Like, I knew that at this point. I slowly turned around as it reached the small of my back, just hoping to God that I wouldn't actually see whatever it was. Because I knew if I saw one of those demons in real life that I saw in my recurring dreams, like, I would have legitimately been traumatized for long term. That's it. I don't know how I would have dealt with that. So that's all I could think about at that moment. But when I turned around, I saw nothing there and quickly sat up in a state of heightened terror. All I could hear was my pounding heartbeat, and as I sat there frozen, out of nowhere, a loud scratch just scraped across the wall right next to my head. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like, just imagine nails on the wall, just a scratch sound. I shot up and ran out of that room so fast. Like, I sat on the couch downstairs for easily an hour trying to process what had just happened. I was so scared at one point I even had my hand just resting on my cousin's door, like contemplating if I was going to open the door and wake him up, him and his girlfriend at the time. Like, I felt like a little kid that had a bad dream or something. It was just staring but was scared of waking his parents up. And I knew there was nothing that they could do to comfort me. You know, what are they going to do? Just be awake? But there I was cracking the door open because I was so desperate for someone's presence just to comfort me somehow. And sure enough, when I did, because I did crack that door open, I was that close to waking them up. But I cracked the door open and Chip came running out of the room. So it definitely wasn't him upstairs. Finally, I shut the door and decided that the only way I was going back up there was if Chip was in my bed with me. So from then on, I made sure he slept upstairs with me every night. Now, later on, weirdly enough, I would come to find out that my cousin's girlfriend frequently experienced sleep paralysis in that house, and worse, would actually be routinely molested by an entity while she was unable to move in that state. It would whisper to her. I firmly believe that we were all inviting these demons into our houses via our various unrepentant sins. I certainly know that I was. These experiences altogether convinced me personally that there is a spiritual realm overlapping with our physical reality. And this was a significant step in my life at that point, as I had never really made any worldview commitments in that regard, and had basically evolved into like a passionately anti-Christian agnostic. While I didn't know exactly what to make of those experiences, and I didn't yet understand how I was opening myself up to them, I knew they were definitely encounters with some kind of conscious spiritual evil, without a doubt. Now, sometime in early 2011, I was exposed to the 9/11 documentary, Loose Change. I don't remember who sent it to me or why I decided to watch it, but this documentary ended up radically altering the course of my life. Because up until I watched that documentary, I was honestly indifferent towards the truth. I was floating down the secular river of self-centered apathy, giving hardly a thought to anything meaningful or transcendent, and certainly nothing controversial. All of that changed, though, when I was exposed to the many lies we'd been told about the attacks on September 11th, as well as the many truths that were consciously and systematically withheld from the public by our governing authorities. Of course, Loose Change was only the tip of the iceberg, and that documentary actually had several inaccuracies in it. 9/11 in Plain Sight was another excellent documentary, and there were many others. I spent countless hours viewing raw footage, reading government documents, listening to presentations from architects and engineers, insisting that the official story of how and why those buildings collapsed couldn't possibly be true. Building 7 and the Pentagon being the smoking guns that really put the dagger into the lies that we were told, at least from my perspective. This absolutely wrecked me, and I cannot over-exaggerate that. The thought that our own government could be complicit, if not outright involved in those attacks, was almost too much for me to bear. I was deeply saddened, yet also enraged on behalf of all those people who lost their lives that day, and including all of the families who were suffering still as a result of it. So I began speaking out publicly online regarding the things that I was discovering. And like many people who are jolted awake in life by a harsh truth that inspires them to want to fight for it, I was zealous, loud, and persistent. Unfortunately, as it often also happens in these scenarios, once I was met with immediate backlash, dismissal, anger, and mockery from so many people I thought were my friends, I very quickly evolved into an insufferably arrogant, rude, and argumentative person online, always on the defensive. It truly is a wonder, and I mean this, how I have any friends from that period of my life. Though the real ones always did see my heart and intentions through my poor and often purposefully offensive deliveries. But this issue of 9/11 led me down many other classic truther rabbit holes as well. The moon landing and NASA's lies, Project Bluebeam, Operation Northwoods, the reality of the poisons in our food and water, the corruption of big agriculture, big pharma, and the military-industrial complex, the truth about the real motivations for the Civil War, the unlawful ratification of the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction, and you name a rabbit hole, I've probably been down it. This phase also made me a huge Ron Paul supporter. His willingness to speak unpopular truths to power really won my respect, especially his strong opposition to the wars for profit in the Federal Reserve. I even went to the Republican National Convention in Tampa to support him in 2012. In time, though, I would become extremely black-pilled on politics, learning about the inaccuracy of electronic voting systems and their liability for being rigged. And this was years before that controversy broke into the mainstream. And that year, 2012, the RNC actually changed the rules on the fly to prevent Ron Paul from acquiring more delegates. In essence, I watched the system itself, at least to some degree, be literally rigged against someone who was daring to challenge it in any serious way. This absolutely crushed me, having placed so much hope in that single person to bring about a positive change in our political landscape. Many years later, though, this experience and perspective would definitely help me to appreciate a passage from the Psalms that we sing during every divine liturgy in the Orthodox Church. Well, let's just say that my employer at the time was probably having some second thoughts about putting me in higher positions of management, as I was causing quite the stir online, which many coworkers were witnessing and also participating in. This led them to refocusing me to a prior position, though they never outright stated that that was the reason. To give you an idea of how insufferably edgy and provocative I was, and I'm not proud of this, on one Memorial Day, when everyone was posting messages of gratitude and thanks for their military veterans, I posted a link to the Iraqi civilian death count with the commentary above saying, "Thank you for your service. Lord have mercy." Like I said, I'm not sure how I had any friends still from that period of time in my life. That very well might have been the worst day of my life, and I genuinely mean that. The backlash was swift, voluminous, and furious. Many ties were severed over that post in my life, and not so good opinions of me were permanently formed by many people who just simply seen enough. Though this happened after my temporary refocus, it is indicative of how I was behaving, though, for over a year at that point, so you can get the idea of what my employer was probably thinking. Calling people stupid, sheeple, judging and accusing everyone who didn't want to learn the truth of these matters as bad people. Absolutely nothing about how I was conducting myself was Christ-like, to put it mildly. And in a year, I went from being the person that, everyone always liked and got along with since grammar school to a person that had a lot of people very confused as to whether or not they liked me at all, with many having made up their mind already. And, as a personal note here, I always valued my relationships with people greatly. I'm a stereotypical extrovert, a people person who is always making it a point to build relationships with personal interactions and inside jokes, etc. I've always had in that way been a bridge builder between people and like a leader in communication, camaraderie, and friendship. You have to be very well adjusted to be able to navigate grammar school as the second shortest kid in your class with glasses and braces, all the while never getting bullied and even becoming the school president. Like, I had to figure out how to navigate those spaces. And I did it well, by God's grace. But I've always loved people, and that's what I'm getting at here. Thus, this period in my life, while so many relationships were being rapidly severed, and publicly in many instances, it was extremely painful for me. It embittered me greatly toward people in general and affected my desire to form new relationships or even trust the ones that I still had. Anyone who's ever stuck their neck out for a controversial truth knows just how fast the people that you thought you knew will cut you out of their lives over a mere disagreement. I did not expect people to be that fickle, and I was extremely naive. This did prove to be providential, though, as my first day there, I had quite the divine appointment. The second person that I met that morning would happen to be my now wife of 7 years, Kelly, Christian name, Catherine, who worked there as a full-time pharmacy technician. A few months later, I was able to score her phone number, and I knew she was special from the very first time that we had a conversation, which happened to be a 3-hour conversation about 9/11. That is not a joke. That was our first phone call ever. Though she was unfamiliar with the details that I was sharing with her, she not only wasn't offended, she was totally open to learning and interested. This quality was so rare, and especially rare for any woman, that I was attracted to. The time on that phone call flew, and in time we ended up together, dating and eventually moving into an apartment together in 2013. Now, I am not proud of this sinful decision and the obvious sins that were associated with it, but it is an important segue to the next period of my life, including my spiritual awakening. So Kelly and I lived together for almost 1.5 years in that apartment, and for most of that time, we were both blind to spiritual things. Our consciences seared with regard to the Christian morality of our youth, and she was also raised a Roman Catholic, by the way. I was routinely going out, clubbing, and getting extremely drunk, and she didn't drink much, but she always came to dance and hang out. And during this extended time period, we learned a great deal about natural cures and healing, continued to expand our knowledge of the corruption and lies surrounding us, especially pertaining to the government, the vaccine and medical industries, and also the secret societies like the Illuminati, the Masons, Skull and Bones, Bilderberg Group, etc. And I also continued to study astral projection, spending many hours on forums reading about people's experiences in the astral realm. Now, one thing that really terrified me and discouraged me from actually trying to project myself was the near universal experience of encountering what people would refer to as low vibrational, negative or demonic entities who hate you and want to intimidate or even kill you. There were endless debates about whether or not being killed in the astral realm would result in your actual physical death in reality. And many people refer to this as having your silver cord cut, though others would say it is impossible to be severed. This debate intrigued me, but it also terrified me as I was already fully convinced of the existence of these demonic entities. Every time I would consider and get really close to attempting to project myself, I thought about those nightmarish beings that I encountered in my recurring dream, and something deep down in my gut just always convinced me not to mess around with the spiritual world. I mean, I knew myself enough to know I was unprepared and unwilling to deal with one of those apparently inevitable encounters. No thanks. Thank God for his grace even when we were stumbling in darkness, truly. Now, in the summer of 2013, I was having a debate with a Christian on my Facebook friends list that I had never met in real life. We'd been friends for years at that point, and I had come to respect her views on different things, as she proved herself to be well-researched and intelligent. I don't remember what sparked this debate exactly, but all I know is that she was refuting Darwinian evolution and absolutely, figuratively backhanded me in public on my own page. Being someone who prided himself on open-mindedness, I was begrudgingly required to take the L. In my mind, I would simply do a little bit of research, figure out why she was wrong, and revisit the public conversation in triumph. That's how I pictured it in my mind. Only one little problem with that little scenario, turns out she was right and I was wrong. So after months of deep diving into the science and history surrounding this subject, I became fully convinced that evolution, at least what many refer to as macroevolution or molecules to man evolution, didn't even qualify as a scientific theory. Worse, it seemed at this point in history anyway, given what we do actually know, it seemed to be an outright lie being propagated to the masses. So I searched endlessly for concrete, observable evidence of some kind of biological mechanism by which new, complex, and ordered information could enter into a genome where said information didn't previously exist. And there was none. It was all assumptions drawn from what is actually observable. This absolutely blew my mind. Also, the problem of irreducible complexity really did seem to be insurmountable for this theory as well. And of course, when the theory was put forth by Darwin himself, he didn't realize what we now know about the complexity of cells, at the cellular level and all of these other things. So, it was more understandable that he thought his theory was tenable. So I read through paper after paper, skipping down to where's the evidence, and then every time I would find the portion that talked about the observable evidence, it never satisfied that requirement of new, complex, and ordered information. They always were playing with the word information in a way that would allow them to say new information was added, but it never satisfied the kind of new information that would be necessary for macroevolution, if that makes sense. So as I read through these papers, it turns out that I realized mutations actually only cause genetic loss or scramble around what's already there. This was a monumental realization, and I can't overstate it enough. That really softened my heart toward the scriptures, since the person who put me onto the lie was a Christian defending the Genesis creation account. People don't realize how accepting an old earth and evolution pulls up the Christian faith from its roots, and far too many are willing to embrace this lie in a futile effort to reconcile it with their faith, rather than face the scorn and mockery of the world relative to this subject. One final note on evolution. I've seen over the years many people try to dismiss this perspective of young earth creation as people who came to this conclusion from reading the scriptures in a certain way and then needing the science to conform to their understanding of the scriptures. Thus, kind of like accusing them of turning a blind eye to science that might contradict their understanding of the scriptures, which took precedence. I can't stress enough that for me, it was actually the other way around. I purely investigated the science first as an unbeliever and realized that it's not worthy of being taken seriously as a scientific theory. So Christians don't have a scientific reason to take this stuff seriously. That's what I'm getting at. Like, it's not like there's all this evidence and, oh, we're struggling to make sense of everything in our faith. Like, no, I was an unbeliever and I studied the science and came to the firm conclusion that this was a lie. Perhaps it just started off as an innocent error, though I doubt it. Or at least I would say it was demonically influenced. But the bottom line is, at this point, it's a lie. Like, because it's being peddled as a fact. That's the issue. People say, oh, yeah, well, it's just a theory. They say it's just a theory. Do they, though? Is that what people come away from high school and college thinking? I don't think so. So, anyway, can't stress that enough. I did not come to a particular biblical interpretation and then have to have the science fit my understanding of religion. I became open-minded to the Christian religion and to the truth of the scriptures because I realized evolution was a lie from studying the science. I hope that important point makes sense to you. Now, this issue proved to be an open door into investigating other aspects of biblical history recorded in Genesis, such as the Great Flood and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as the existence of giants, all of which proved to have an abundance of archaeological and geological evidence supporting them. What do you know? Realizing that these events actually happened was rocking my world, legitimately. Though I didn't quite know what to make of it all yet, I was starving to learn more. And for the first time in my life, I had a sincere desire to read the Bible for myself. While on the outside, my heart was still incredibly hard, unbeknownst to me, on the inside was brewing an insatiable love for the truth himself. And even before these discoveries, for years, I knew self-evidently that the Bible was worthy of my investigation. It was almost something that I would just have to eventually explore out of begrudging obligation. I can't explain why I felt that way exactly, but I just knew that I couldn't be a serious truth seeker without ever forming an opinion on its contents. Now, though, I had compelling reasons to embark on that journey. My view of the Bible had already changed from one of militant skepticism and even outright opposition to one of respect and mysterious curiosity, and I hadn't even started to read it yet. Now, with all of these different rabbit holes I'd been down, seemingly converging in different ways, I became curious about the notion of demonic possession. From my experiences, as well as from the thousands of testimonies about the astral realm, and even from the biblical testimony, it was clear that demons existed. Thus, I reasoned in my head, if there really was evidence of these entities being driven out by Christians, it would support the idea that the Jesus of the Bible really is God. At the same time, I was also exploring alien abductions, which were routinely ended by people calling on the name of Jesus, something that people in the alien circles really work hard to suppress, interestingly enough. I was also studying the testimonies of alleged survivors of satanic ritual abuse. Probably one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard was a woman who claimed to be offered by her parents for this purpose from childhood. It was a very dark period of study for me. At this point in our relationship, Kelly was keeping up pretty well and was genuinely interested to continue on this truth-seeking journey by my side. However, when I started getting into the darker stuff, she became noticeably disinterested. In truth, I think she was just getting burnt out. 2 years since we had met had us both jumping from topic to topic, and many times it involved breaking our conditioning on things we thought we understood for our whole lives. It was a lot. In this topic, the dark forces of the spiritual realm, and particularly demonic possession, genuinely scared her. And I will never forget one night in our apartment, I was researching the subject with my headphones on. She asked me to do that out of respect because she really didn't want to hear anything about it at all. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that my headphones weren't actually plugged in, but my speakers were still on. I played a video of an alleged exorcism, and the horrific screams of the demon-possessed girl were instantly blasting into our living room. I was so shocked that I struggled to scramble and shut it off for a few moments, and she was angry, yelling at me to turn it off. But by the time I did, she was visibly shaken, and those sounds deeply upset her. I understand why, as they were indeed otherworldly in a very evil way. This instance sadly really strengthened her resolve to disengage the subject entirely, and I felt really badly about that.
I'm sick of all these lies. They keep telling me that I am unable to read between the lines.
Now, finally, on the evening of April 14, 2014, my life genuinely changed forever. And in an instant. Someone had sent me a documentary titled Age of Deceit, Fallen Angels and the New World Order. I decided to stay up late and watch it, as I'm a night owl and most of my research was done well into the early morning at that time anyway. Not much has changed. Now, this documentary affected me deeply. It basically addressed all of these different rabbit holes that I'd been down over the past several years and tied them all together in the most coherent way with the biblical narrative. It explained the satanic motivations behind all of the evil in the world that I was so acutely aware of by that point, and it made perfect sense to me. The various horrors committed in the world were most certainly of a spiritual origin. No other origin really made sense. The perpetrators were almost always already rich, powerful, and famous. They already had everything that the devil could promise them in this world. It was clear to me by then that these people were taking orders from spiritual powers in high places, and this is why human sacrifices were often so necessary an aspect of their rituals. Thus, it was not exactly shocking to kick down the door of every one of these secret societies and heinous atrocities and find Kabbalists or theistic Satanists orchestrating all of them. I knew all of these things instinctively, almost on a subconscious level, but never before had the reality of all these connections been made so clear to me. I was glued to the screen for hours as everything started clicking and making total sense in real time. Now, by the end of this presentation, there was something that at any other time in my life, I would have considered to be the lamest, most corny thing. I'm summarizing, but the narrator was essentially like, if you believe everything that was just presented here and you haven't committed your life to Jesus Christ, what are you doing? Like, do it right now. Again, that's paraphrasing, but that's what I took from it. And as he said that, I remember viscerally feeling the weight of that decision that laid before me. Like, I realized some of the implications if I were to embrace Christ and the scriptures as the source of all truth. A lot in my life would undoubtedly have to change. But I also knew in that moment that I genuinely did believe that the scriptures not only explained and accounted for all of our reality, but actually and also laid out the hope for our salvation from this world of delusion and lies. I trusted the Bible, and I hadn't even read it yet. So then the narrator offered a brief presentation of the gospel and invited the viewer to reject Satan, ask forgiveness of Christ, and embrace him in faith. I believed. In that moment, I was so ripe for the harvest that I was almost ready to cry hearing those words. I was so weary with seeking for so long, so tired of the evil, the darkness, the disappointment, the despair, and all of the lies. As I pondered all of these things and consciously committed to Christ in my heart at that moment, all of a sudden, while laying on the couch in my living room with my girlfriend in the bedroom nearby, I began to experience rapid, warm, full body waves of tingling going from my head to my toes and back and forth again. It happened for probably 20 or 30 seconds, and it was an experience like none other to that point in my life. I wasn't expecting anything like that to happen. I wasn't even hoping for it. I was caught totally off guard. The only way I could really describe it was that it was like a physical confirmation that I had just found the truth, like a gift or a God wink. In that moment, I'll tell you, I was at peace in a way that I had never been in my entire life. I like to think it was the Holy Spirit gently encouraging me on with that precious sign. For years, I referred to this as my born again experience. Now, of course, being Orthodox, I realize that water baptism is the new birth, so I simply refer to this as my repentance experience, or my moment of repentance. It was time to figure out what being a Christian was all about and to learn my newfound faith. Now, in the following days, I eagerly shared my new blossoming faith with Kelly. I was ecstatic, and all I could think about and talk about was Christ. My studying continued, and within that first week, we went out and actually bought Bibles together. I started in the book of Matthew and was voraciously reading in all of my spare time. I quickly noticed that Kelly did not share that same zeal at all. And not only was she disinterested in reading, but she actually would get frustrated when I would choose to read instead of spend time with her. I mean, she'll tell you herself that she was jealous and wanted my attention instead. So in the weeks following my repentance, the wedge that had existed between us really did become like a chasm. All of a sudden, what was most important to me, the truth, my faith, was something we didn't have in common. As I continued to read through the Gospels and the New Testament, I pretty quickly realized that we were living in sin and was convicted that I couldn't continue this way. However, I, of course, sincerely loved her and didn't want to lose her regardless of how much we didn't relate to one another at that time. So I wrestled with this conviction for a little while, and one night I was feeling especially hypocritical. So feeling stuck and unsure of how to proceed, I prayed from my heart and spoke to God for the first time since I was honestly probably a child. As I laid in bed next to Kelly, I just prayed this simple prayer. Lord, I just want to please you and do what is right. I don't want to lose Kelly. What am I supposed to do? That was basically my entire prayer. After I fell asleep that very night, God immediately answered my prayer in a dream. The dream began with me walking next to God, speaking with him, and basically just continuing the prayer that I was praying before I went to sleep. I didn't see him per se, but I was aware that it was him who was walking beside me. And as I continued to ask what I needed to do about the situation, I kind of began to feel stupid. Like, have you ever asked a dumb question that you should already know the answer to? That's exactly how I felt. Quite foolish. God responded by sort of chuckling and saying, it's actually really easy, Paul. All you need to do is turn away from your sin. And I immediately woke up from that dream. From that moment, I was committed to ending our living arrangement. It just so happened that in the following days, we grew more distant as I pondered on how I was going to resolve things. Ultimately, I decided that the best thing for me to do at that point was to have us break up. I knew that I couldn't make her care about Christ, and I couldn't make her believe. This would have to be an authentic personal journey for her if she were ever to join me on this radical, life-altering path. I was also concerned that she might feign caring in order to stay with me, but then build up resentment, feeling like it's a condition she's trying to meet or something. In the end, I just had to trust God with our lives and take the first step in doing what was morally right and repenting of our sinful relationship. Kelly took this extremely hard. On my end, due to my extremely strong trust in God at that moment, I mean, I had, after all, just been visited by God in a dream and given the exact course of action that I'm to follow. I was very peaceful. Now, don't get me wrong, I was very sad because I loved her, but I was certain that I was doing the right thing. I told her if we are meant to be together, then God will bring us back together, and we will be happy. If we don't end up back together, then we need to trust that it just wasn't meant to be. Yet, if that is the case, we should also be happy because either way, we will be trusting the will of God. And just like that, after 16 months, the woman that I was convinced I was going to marry was packing up and moving back in with her parents. As we said our goodbyes, I told her that our breakup would have to be a real one, that I would not be talking to her or hanging out or anything like that, because I didn't want to lead her on in any way. I also did tell her that the one thing I would always be available for was if she had any questions about her faith, but otherwise I wouldn't be interacting. I didn't want to pressure her either. Whatever path was about to take form for her, she needed to walk it apart from my influence. Thus, the months went by. Occasionally, Kelly would text me and ask if I wanted to have dinner, and I would initially politely decline. Sometimes, if she kept trying to talk to me, I would have to ignore her, which was very painful and difficult because deep down I loved her and of course wanted to talk with her. But I had to trust my instincts. If she were to come to faith, it would have to be an act of God. Now, that summer in 2014, while we were broken up, some random guy reached out to me on Facebook Messenger and asked if I was the one who did the cover of Tom York and Bjork's I've Seen It All on YouTube. I confirmed that it was indeed me and my sister, and he messaged me again and said we should meet up and chat about the faith sometime. At that point, I was confused because I had no idea he was even local, but turns out he lived like a half hour away from me. It was through this brother, John, who is now one of my best friends and preparing to become an Orthodox catechumen, that I ended up at Warrior Building, a young adult Bible study. At this study, I would meet numerous other lifelong friends, and through it, I would naturally assimilate into the non-denominational church that most of them belonged to. For me, my Christian journey up until that point had been extremely lonely for the first 5 months. So I was elated and overjoyed to have finally found some authentic fellowship with people who shared a similar zeal for Christ.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelly. I am Paul's wife, and I'm here just to share with you my own experiences of what it was like for me after Paul and I broke up and leading up until when we got back together. But first we're going to play a game called Can You Find the Icon That's Missing from the wall? Can you figure out which one? Because Paul had to bring one to church today. Today is the Sunday of Orthodoxy. So, as Paul left off, we broke up and we were both very much still in love with one another, and it was really difficult. Very, very, very difficult. Probably one of the worst times of my life, honestly. He was very kind and said, you know, if we get back together, it's going to be a happy time because that means that God wanted us to get back together. But if we don't get back together and we both end up with someone else or going down a different road, we'll be happy as well. So obviously that was a hard thing to hear and a hard perspective to adopt. And I did not adopt that right away, of course, because I'm a normal human being and I loved him and I wanted to be with him. But he helped me graciously move everything back into my parents, and we left it on very good terms because we cared about one another. And honestly, I spent the first 2 weeks sleeping on my parents' couch because I refused to unpack anything that was in my bedroom. And that bedroom was full. It was packed with everything. And I refused to unpack it because I kind of was in disbelief of what had happened. And I cried myself to sleep, I'm telling you, every single night for at least 2 weeks. And I was really good during the day because, you know, you're preoccupied, but I was heartbroken. I could have very easily just made up that I cared about Christianity again. And it wouldn't have really even been fully made up because I did grow up Catholic. I knew and had faith in God, but I didn't realize at that time that it was my own version of God that I was believing in, because I really didn't have too much knowledge of the history. Honestly, I had no knowledge of the history of the church. And so I did not go down that road because Paul knows me too well, and I know myself too well. I wear my emotions on my sleeve pretty much 24/7, and he would know that it was false, and I would know that it was false. You know, it was our relationship was filled with me and Paul learning about stuff together, going down many rabbit holes and educating ourselves on so many topics. And that was a huge part of our relationship. It's actually that was our first conversation. It's how our whole relationship began, was studying things together and learning and growing together. And so I knew and I trusted that if Paul had gone down this road that I had yet to go down, and I was very stubbornly not wanting to go down that road, just simply because I didn't care personally at that time. I didn't care enough. But I knew, based off of how our relationship went, that if it was important to Paul, that it was obviously a topic that was worthwhile for everyone to be looking into, including myself. So you would think that would maybe motivate me a little bit more, but I didn't have him by my side, and so I wasn't as motivated to look into it, even though I was that heartbroken. I still was kind of just stubborn and just trying to even get through the emotions of that current period of my life. Something that happened after the first 2 weeks, I was like, okay, enough is enough. I need to clear out my room so I can actually sleep in there. And my whole family was gone, and I was by myself. I was trying to unpack, and I just got so overwhelmed with my own feelings and then how much there was to do and feeling alone, scared. And you know, when you're with someone, you could picture your future, but then when you're not with them, all of a sudden it's like you're trying to picture your future and it's just like a white page. And that's what was showing up in my brain, was nothing. That's why my emotions were so high. And I just started crying so hard that for the first time in my life, I actually started, I went to say hallucinating. I started hyperventilating. I could not even get myself to stop, and I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going to throw up because I just was hyperventilating so bad, and I didn't know what else to do. And so I remember being on my knees naturally from trying to clean out my room. And I looked up to God, and I just yelled out, "Help me." I think I yelled it out a few times, actually. Out of nowhere, I just got this sense of calm and peace. My emotions felt more balanced. I stopped crying, and I felt like I could breathe again. And that was one of the first instances that I had in my life where I felt like, wow, God obviously was listening to me. I knew God was real, but that was the first, almost like an interaction where I reached out and he responded immediately. I was so thankful that happened. Life went on, and I luckily at that time where I was working, my best friend was working at the same spot, and she at the time was a Protestant Christian. So naturally things would come up in conversation about God and about the faith with her. And I'm really thankful that she was so close to me at that time, because she really helped me to discover the motivation to start looking into things by myself. Because up until that point, I would try to even just open the Bible and read it by myself. And I would find it so boring. I would find it hard to understand. I would not be motivated to continue after only mere minutes sometimes. And so in talking to her, it was helpful for me to understand some new concepts. I got to see how much she cared about God and the faith, and she really walked me through some things. And so I started to actually care a little bit. She even brought me to a couple services at a Protestant church. And so I did start to care a little bit. I would text Paul here and there some questions. He was gracious enough to respond only to those texts about the Christian faith, and kind of guide me as to resources to read or things in the Bible to look at. But don't get me wrong, he wouldn't respond to any other text, which was another reason why it was so hard. But I finally started to adopt that notion that he had shared with me when we broke up. It was probably about halfway through our breakup. We were broken up for about 4 months. It was probably around 2 months I started to feel better about the situation that we were in, because obviously I still loved him immensely. But I started to realize that God truly is in charge. And if he wanted us to be together, it was going to work out and we'd be very happy together. And if we weren't meant to be together and there was someone else better for me, then I would be happy. So I felt like in a much better place mentally and emotionally at this time, a couple months into the breakup. And so, because of my friend and all those conversations and stuff, I did start to care a little bit more. I still wasn't fully on board, still living my kind of like normal lifestyle. And I went to bed one night and I just had the most crazy interaction with God that I had ever had, and still to this day have ever had with God. And I'll share with you I still remember the details like I just had the dream last night. But I was like right outside of heaven. Couldn't see anything, could not see God, but I knew that I was with God. And the reason that I knew I was with God was because I had this feeling of like the greatest, most extreme love that you can feel from a dad. And so like the love that you have for your father here on earth, but times seriously like 1,000. It was so strong. And so I knew I was with God. I knew that he was there. His presence was there. And I was so happy. And I remember smiling like so big. I reached out like a little kid does for their dad to pick them up. And he reached down to, I don't even know if you can see my arms. He reached down to pick me up and to hug me back. But as I was reaching up and he was reaching down to get me, he couldn't grab me. He couldn't even touch me. And the smile that I had, I'm getting emotional. I haven't talked about this in a long time. The smile that I had and the feeling of love that I had, the love was still there, but he couldn't even grab me if he wanted to, is what it felt like. And I started to fall. And I realized where I was falling, to hell. And I realized the immense sadness that he felt as the father. And I no longer had the smile. I was scared and I was sad and remorseful. Sorry. And I woke up. Excuse me. And I woke up literally at that moment as I was falling. And I was crying. When I woke up, I was crying in real life. And I was sweating. And my heart was beating so fast. Obviously, I knew that that was a true interaction with God, and God giving me a wake-up call that this is what you have in store for you. This is what's in store for you. If you don't get your act together and start caring and start genuinely seeking me. And I was like, okay. It was so hard to even go on with my life the rest of that day, because all I kept thinking about was that dream and that interaction. And I'm like, nothing else matters. I can't have that happen to me. I don't want to be apart from God. And so I actually started to care. And I don't remember ever even texting Paul about that dream. I just started to study more and look into things more on my own. Like I would go to work. I remember bringing the Bible to work with me. And on my lunch break, I would go outside by myself and read. And I would ask the Holy Spirit to try to guide me and help me to understand it, because I still struggled in that area a little bit. Anyways, I started studying more, and then I finally did continue to reach out to Paul more and more about questions in regards to the faith, genuinely asking for some guidance, and also asking my friend from work for guidance. I also continued my weekly texting Paul, knowing that he was going to say no, asking if he wanted, hey, do you want to get together for dinner? And he would always so graciously say no. But this time I think I had just told Paul finally. So now this was like 4 months after we broke up. I think I had finally told him about the dream, where I was at in my journey at that point. And then I asked him the one night when I left work if he wanted to have dinner. And I still remember that that day as if it were yesterday as well, because he said yes. And I could not believe it, because I knew that he said we would never get back together to like even hang out, because he never wanted to lead me on. He didn't want to lead himself on either, because he knew that we loved each other. If we were going to see each other again, it wouldn't be worth it to get back together until he knew that we had a future together for sure. And same for me. And so when he said yes, I was like, oh my gosh, I was so happy. He hugged me when I walked in the door, and I was like, okay, like this is it. Like we're on the same page. We're both gonna take this journey together. We had so much to learn. I mean, he was further ahead than I was, but I was so thankful and relieved to be back together again, to have his support. And if I can urge any of you guys to look into the history of the church. I wish that we knew it back then, but I'm thankful for the journey that we took. But if I can urge any of you to skip right to that portion of your research, that would be a very big goal of mine. And I'd be very happy that I maybe assisted any of you in your journey just from sharing my story. So yeah, so here's Paul.
And within 6 months, we were married. And a day later, she was pregnant with our firstborn child, Amelia Grace. We were wed in that same non-denominational church, and we continued attending there for about 2.5 years total. Now, from the time of my conversion, God began pruning major routine sins out of my life. Almost as if it were some miracle, I went cold turkey in abstaining from pornography and self-abuse for almost 3 months straight. It was definitely a gift of God's grace, considering I hadn't gone more than 2 days in probably a decade to that point. However, I let my guard down, and all of a sudden one day I had fallen again. This was an absolutely devastating fall, because it was the first time I had committed such an egregious sin with full knowledge that I was betraying Christ and disobeying the command of God by doing so. I remember being face down alone in my apartment, laying on the floor and just weeping bitterly, much like St. Peter after his 3 denials. After that, this cycle of falling and abstaining for a time would continue for easily another 2 years. I'm ashamed to admit that this addiction did persist even into my marriage. One thing that really helped me get a handle on this passion, though, was confession. Though I wasn't Orthodox yet and hadn't received the grace of absolution that can only be found in the Holy Mystery, I did eventually commit to my wife to confess to her whenever I sinned in this regard. Pragmatically, this revealed the true scope of the damage of sin right before my eyes. Seeing her pain and her feeling of inadequacy, or the destruction of her self-confidence as a result of my sins, causing her to weep. It made the consequences of my sins very real, because all too often when we sin, we think we're just affecting ourselves, but sin never just affects ourselves, and that's something I came to learn with clarity once I became Orthodox, and the cosmic scope of sin as well as redemption. Now, I was still swearing a couple months after my repentance until I came across St. Paul's exhortation in Ephesians 4:29, which says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace upon the hearers." Seeing that was really all it took for me to put that problem to bed. However, there was another aspect of that which I was unable to drop so quickly. In fact, I remember sitting in my living room after I read this and thinking, wow, I can't make inappropriate jokes anymore. How am I going to be funny? Like, I'm literally going to have to kill an entire aspect of who I am, of my personality. But I also remember following up those thoughts with essentially a shrug of the shoulders, thinking, oh well. To this day, I constantly am attacked by demonic thoughts of crude and vulgar jokes that come to mind. Though I never speak them out anymore, I'm constantly repelling them. Now, drinking was more of a challenge. I stopped getting obscenely drunk pretty quickly. However, I was still pushing the envelope on many occasions for some time. It was difficult because I was a very social person, and for many of the good friends I had at that time, several of whom I'm blessed to retain in my life still, if we were going to do something, it was almost always involved going out drinking. So it was hard for me to learn to drink in moderation when the entire point of me drinking for, so many years was to get absolutely hammered. Forgive my candidness. But as I continued to learn and grow in repentance, I was studying the faith continuously as well, dedicating copious amounts of my time familiarizing myself with Christian apologetics. Hours and hours of debates, lectures, sermons, presentations, and street preaching videos for months and years on end. I listened to almost every James White debate, and some multiple times. This gave me quite the anti-Catholic bent. In retrospect, though some criticisms were justified, much of it was truly rooted in historical ignorance, or at least historical manipulation. For a time, I religiously listened to his podcast show, The Dividing Line. I was encouraged by sermons from Francis Chan, Vodi Baucham, and John Piper. I was convicted by Paul Washer and John MacArthur. I was motivated by Jeff Durbin and his apologetics, as well as his anti-abortion ministry with Apologia Church. I was schooled by Greg Bonson and Jason Lyle. I was educated on the beauty and science of biblical creation by Kent Hovind, Trey Smith, and Ken Ham's ministry with Answers in Genesis. I couldn't get enough. I not only wanted to best understand why I believed what I did, but I also wanted to be able to help others come to Christ. 1 Peter 3:15 was something that resonated with me deeply, which reads, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you for a reason of the hope that is within you, with meekness and fear." So I didn't want to leave a single stone unturned in this regard. I knew how people having no answers or bad answers led me to abandon my faith and feel justified in doing so. So I continued to read the scriptures and listen to them via the audio Bible on YouTube. And, I got through the Pentateuch many times and the rest of the Old Testament several times. I would kind of bounce around in the New Testament. One major subject that I spent several years studying at this point was cosmology. I will spare the details and arguments and just skip to what I carefully classify myself as today in this regard, which is a bare minimum geocentrist that leans heavily towards the idea of a fixed, motionless plane and an impenetrable dome firmament. I only really mention it because it was yet another instance where I ultimately came to recognize pseudo-science and outright lies being propagated by world governments, institutions of public learning and higher education, as well as entertainment and media alike. It also struck me as no coincidence that the same people who were censoring information regarding other true conspiracies and scrubbing videos from the internet or burying them on the last pages of Google search were also doing the same with this subject. Why did they care so much? Am I really supposed to believe that it's out of genuine concern for truth all of a sudden, or the well-being of society? They're just protecting us. The people responsible for erasing this content from the internet would go on eventually to participate in the greatest disinformation campaign of my lifetime, actively pushing demonstrable and harmful lies, silencing dissent when the whole was introduced. Is there anyone paying an ounce of attention now who cares about the truth at all, who still doesn't realize the evil that we're dealing with? And while we're touching on the subject of that subject in general was something that really fostered within Kelly and I a deep and confident distrust of the medical industrial complex. From the researchers to the manufacturers to the regulatory agencies tasked with keeping them all honest, to the doctors on the front lines who in many cases mindlessly and irresponsibly peddle whatever it is they were told to by the broken, misguided, and corrupt system built on treating the symptoms of illness rather than finding the root cause and addressing those. We agreed before we had any children that we would not be doing and, one of the most startling discoveries on that subject, and there were many, was that millions of people were unwittingly inoculated with a polio vaccine that was knowingly contaminated with the simian monkey virus SV40. Just to give a quick summary of this issue, the polio were being cultured on the kidney cells of rhesus monkeys, in which SV40 was later found to be endemic. This discovery was made by Bernice Eddy, a virologist and epidemiologist employed by the government, but only after mass batches of the vaccines were already produced. This virus, SV40, was known at the time to cause brain and bone cancers, malignant mesothelioma, and lymphomas in laboratory animals. Both the manufacturer and the government regulatory agencies were made aware of this reality, yet, fearing both financial loss and the loss of public trust, the decision was made to distribute them anyway. For years, an entire generation of human beings in America were being inoculated with a cancer-causing monkey virus, with full knowledge of those who created the vaccine and approved its usage. To this day, it is still debated whether or not SV40 causes cancer in humans, but whether it does or not doesn't change the reality of what happened and the fact that they knew it caused cancer and all of these other issues in the animals they had already tested it on. This is just one single example of why we would never, ever trust this industry or its products with the lives of our children. Also, I found it quite ironic that the polio is the one that everyone defaults to in order to defend the efficacy of vaccines. Yet, even that is likely a lie, as polio was essentially relabeled when the same symptoms began to be diagnosed as Guillain-Barré syndrome. So, the smoking gun that ultimately indicated the sheer and unhinged madness of this whole V schedule was the fact that they actually recommend that newborn infants fresh out of the womb get a hepatitis B, a disease almost exclusively contracted as an STD. We also noticed the aggressive uptick in media campaigns against anti-vaxxers in the years leading up to the C outbreak. Yet, in almost every instance where they were being blamed for outbreaks of various diseases, when you dug into the story, it was either almost entirely or even exclusively vaccinated individuals who fell ill. Something was very clearly amiss. Finally, I was put on to the fact that Jonas Salk, the father of modern nation, who created the polio, was an open evolutionist and eugenicist who peddled the anti-human overpopulation myth, advocating for population control in his book, Survival of the Wisest. Then there was Bill Gates, a man so corrupt the U.S. government had no choice but to hold him accountable for violating antitrust laws with Microsoft. When the U.S. government is the moral authority keeping people in check. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. The Epstein Island and Lolita Express frequenter, old Bill, who was on TV pushing the same anti-human narrative as Salk, all the while testing dangerous on poor people in India and Africa, paralyzing and even killing many, making a fortune off of these lethal products. The final straw for us on this subject was really learning that many of these common on the schedule were actually produced and tested by utilizing aborted fetal tissue and by replicating the fragmented DNA of literal murdered children. Like, could this industry get any darker? Needless to say, it became clear that could very easily become a useful tool for ushering in the impending one world antichrist system via some sort of medical pass or something. A global medical crisis was almost certainly in the cards at some point, we figured anyway. It would be way too easy, and the masses were being primed and conditioned. And that was before ever reading anything from St. Paisios or even knowing that he existed. Suffice it to say, we were not at all shocked when C emerged the way that it did. I immediately knew, as did many, many others, that this was a man-made disease and the agenda was all about forced and depopulation. I don't think it took any particular degree of spiritual discernment to see where this was all headed. All you had to really do was care enough to pay attention, like just a little bit over the last several years. Now, shifting back to faith matters, between some of our experiences at our non-denominational church, coupled with different questions that I was encountering pertaining to scriptural interpretation, I was definitely being led to reevaluate not only the church that we were in, but even some of our most fundamental Christian beliefs. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it extremely clear that nothing I am about to say is a judgment against any individual, and everyone who is going to be referenced here are people that we believe had and have very pure intentions with regard to what they believe and how they worship. There is definitely a great potential to cause offense here to many people I hold dear still to this day, and that is not at all my intention. But the whole purpose, again, of this video is to faithfully recount my experiences and what led me to the place that I am at today as an Orthodox Christian. Thus, I have to include what is relevant to that end. Now, on the experiential end, there are a few instances that I would like to note. The first is a weird phenomenon that would happen to me occasionally, but at distinct times. It first started when I was attending Warrior Building, the Bible study group. My body would start to shake to the point of tremors. It would start in my chest and my upper body and almost spread out into my shoulders and arms and down to my legs and even in my face, which would appear to be violently shivering, like when it got really bad. It would sometimes start when I was driving there and would continue to increase until while I was there, it was to the point where I was barely able to hide it. Usually I would just pass it off as if I was cold and shivering. And to be honest, I wanted to believe that that was what was happening. But later on, I would come to find out there was definitely something spiritual about this as well. It would also hit me when we would go to church sometimes, though it became pretty infrequent until one day. It was the day I was baptized at our church. The ceremony was held outside where they had a heated baptismal pool dug into the ground. Now, at this church, when compared to the ancient necessity of the period of catechism before baptism and all of that, baptism here was really treated quite flippantly. There's just no polite way to say it. Some people planned on being baptized ahead of time, but they would always do a sort of altar call at the end where people who felt led could come up and be baptized. And anyone who was already baptized was welcome to come be baptized again as a means to recommit themselves to Christ. Of course, all of this is wildly ahistorical and unorthodox, but these were problems that weren't fully revealed to me until later. That day, many people came up to be baptized. As I waited my turn under the pavilion, I started getting the shakes again. And this was before I went into the water. By the time I was actually baptized, I was keenly aware that this was somehow a demonic attack. The thought had been in the back of my mind for a while, and I was kind of secretly hoping that being baptized would immediately free me from this kind of odd recurring issue. In my mind, I was kind of figuring that maybe I was somehow possessed, and that's why it only happened at times when I was present for some sort of like church-related function. Like the demons were upset by my pursuit of Christ in that way, or by the presence of other Christians. Like, I didn't really know. I was just trying to figure it out. Well, I guess the opposite ended up taking place than what I hoped for. Because when I came out of the water and made my way up to get a towel, I began to have violent, full-body tremors. The only way I could describe it is if you found someone who'd been stuck out in the snow for an hour in the dead of winter with only like shorts and a t-shirt on. I couldn't control my body. It was all involuntary. My teeth were wildly chattering. I couldn't even speak. My close friends who were waiting to receive me out of the pool immediately noticed that something wasn't right, and they all grabbed me and started praying out loud for me to ward off this demonic attack. Eventually, it did stop, but I was left feeling confused and very unsettled by the whole experience, especially when it continued to happen on occasion in a more mild form even after that, indicating that the baptism had not accomplished what I hoped it would in that regard. Now, another factor that started making Kelly and I aware that there was something off about our church was the general lack of reverence during gatherings for corporate worship. Our perception of the whole Sunday experience there really began to strike us as somewhat of a show that we came to watch rather than a worship service we came to participate in. It was almost like a church service built on a format influenced by modern entertainment. First of all, there was the whole idea of a stage. The hyped up welcome portion carried out by a very lively individual whose goal is to literally get people excited to be there. A hype guy in the very real sense. Again, if this person is watching, I love and respect you. You've been nothing but sincerely kind to me and my family. This isn't a you thing. It's a systemic church thing. I've been at other Protestant churches that use this identical format for corporate worship. Now, this welcome portion was always followed by some music played by the worship band on the stage, generally 3 songs. Then there was a short extemporaneous vocal prayer by one of the worship leaders, or perhaps even someone out in the crowd. This would usher in the portion for the offering, where we would all be told to hold our offering up before the Lord as we recited together a pre-written prayer about sowing and reaping. This was followed by the sermon, which would be at least 45 minutes to an hour before closing with a few more worship songs and an altar call. Besides that quick prayer at the end of the opening worship period, this extemporaneous prayer by the pastor during this altar call was really the only main time for corporate prayer in the entire service from start to finish. Now, some questions we were led to ask as we lived this reality on a weekly basis and continued to study the scriptures were as follows. If traditions of men in the Catholic Church are wrong, what makes these traditions in our church not? Because, they very obviously are traditions. The format of the church service, the altar call, the way they do communion, it's all tradition. But what distinguishes traditions of men from authentic Christian traditions? Because what I believed up until that point, as a result of my independent studies, and most certainly what my church was teaching me at the time, was that what separated traditions of men from traditions of God were whether or not they were biblical. But what was biblical about kicking off a Sunday service with a 10-minute video on the big center screen celebrating the Buffalo Bills making it to the playoffs? Or about being baptized again to recommit yourself to Christ? There were also things that struck me as profoundly unbiblical, for instance, allowing a visiting woman pastor to give a sermon from time to time, or doing altar calls at all. Further, if evangelicals wanted to criticize the deadness of the written prayers of the Catholic Church, then why did they take no issue with the pre-written prayer at the offering? Hearing everyone recite the words together always reminded me of when we would recite the Apostles' Creed at Mass growing up Catholic. What was this picking and choosing exactly? Was this not an arbitrary or at least purely subjective determination of what constituted traditions of men? One major subject that I absolutely must discuss, painful and shameful as it really is the topic of biblical polygyny, or men having multiple wives. This is to be differentiated from polygamy, which could also involve a woman having multiple husbands. Now, I don't remember how I stumbled upon this question of what constituted biblical marriage, but it was one of two major questions that ended up experientially refuting the Reformed doctrine of sola scriptura that I had to that point been defending with vigor. Now, without getting into too much detail, suffice it to say that after many, many months of studying this subject, I came to the radical conclusion that polygyny was a blessed marital arrangement by God, and not just in the past, but also in the New Covenant. Now, I realize for some people this is shocking to hear, or perhaps even absurd, but I poured through the scriptures and heard every argument for and against, and to this day I firmly believe if someone wants to operate from the perspective of purely the scriptures alone, I could win this debate every day of the week in favor of polygyny not only not being sinful, but being a blessed marital arrangement. Now, let me be clear, I am not here to try to defend that position today, so I will spare you all of the arguments. But why am I talking about this here? Why was this so significant to my journey? Well, for two reasons, really. First, it revealed to me that Protestants only adhere to sola scriptura, whether explicitly or functionally, when it suits them. It becomes an excuse to reject beliefs and practices that they don't like or agree with, but at the same time, positions they hold can't even be defended or upheld by using this very same principle. I was not seeking an echo chamber on this radical perspective on marriage. In fact, I wanted to be wrong. Even studying this subject caused tremendous pain for my wife. It even upset a beloved couple that we were very close friends with, effectively destroying our relationship with them. It would have been so much more preferable to just be wrong and be shown why I was wrong. But I wanted the truth, and I wasn't going to be satisfied with inconsistent answers that betrayed my entire epistemic foundation of the scriptures alone. Yet every time I talked to a pastor, either at my own church or at a different local church, about this subject to bounce my perspective off of them and get their thoughts, they would essentially hand wave it away and ignore all of my Old Testament examples with the most shallow explanations and point to a single New Testament verse to justify their defense of monogamy only for New Covenant Christians. So in short, what I discovered was that when the rubber met the road, evangelicals and Protestants will appeal to the historic mind of the institutional Apostolic Church to justify their beliefs. In other words, they are perfectly content to use extra biblical tradition as an authoritative source when it suits them. Further, even if they wanted to simply argue the scripture, who had the authority to deliberate these interpretive dilemmas of truth and morality anyway? It was a very wild thing to experientially realize that I was not beholden to my pastor's interpretations about literally anything. After all, they were just fallible men, no different than me. Sure, I viewed them as having some kind of vague spiritual authority over me, but the reality is that it was a voluntary submission, right? I was voluntarily submitting myself to their spiritual authority because I happened to presently agree enough with what they believed and taught about the faith. But their beliefs were subject to change at any time, and so were mine. Thus, if at any point we came to disagree about something, I could just leave and go somewhere else, and I would no longer be under their spiritual authority. The absolute best they could ever do if they thought I was in grave sin or believing some kind of heresy is excommunicate me from their local congregation. They have no real authority over my soul to bind my conscience to their teaching or to prevent me from just going to another church or even from starting my own church. And when I sat down and brought this issue of polygyny up to one of my pastors, that's pretty much what he said, like straight up. I'll paraphrase, but he basically said, we don't have to agree on this issue to still both be Christians. You can go somewhere else that believes like you do, and we can love each other from a distance. Now, he was sincere when he said that, and not intending to be hurtful or dismissive, but that was honestly even scarier and more jarring. He meant what he said. He meant that we could all just be believing these different things and still be Christians. And why wouldn't he mean that? Of course he meant it. Who in this paradigm had any authority to actually define the boundaries of Christian belief on any matter whatsoever? Who has any authority to excommunicate someone from the actual church, the body of Christ, not just some local congregation or satellite fellowship? Coming to terms with the purely subjective interpretive nature of this entire ordeal was startling. How could nobody have the authority to actually tell me I'm wrong? This was a burning question that was honestly scary, considering how many times I've altered my own theological perspective in the past. I hadn't fully wrapped my head around the consequences of this faulty epistemology yet, but I was definitely getting there. In light of all these questions, observations, and experiences, there was also this very strange feeling that I always had deep down that I never felt confident inviting people to my church. Sure, I would talk publicly about my faith online and in person to no end. I even went out and did some public evangelization, though not obnoxiously, thank God. I was totally comfortable talking to people about Jesus and winning them to what I thought was the Christian faith. But I never felt right inviting them to church. I started realizing toward the end, before we left, that the reason was I never was confident that this was representative of the truth about what the church was supposed to be. How could I invite someone to a church where I'm already asking the question for myself of whether or not this church is really a biblical church? As a matter of fact, what was a biblical church? Honestly, what is even the church? I didn't know the answers to those questions, but by the time December of 17 rolled around, Kelly and I were at least confident that this church wasn't it. The other thing that this subject of polygyny eventually highlighted for me was just how dangerous heresy can be. Now, by the grace of God, Kelly and I never acted on any of our convictions that polygyny was a blessed marital union. However, I was actively on forums of like-minded Christians, not Mormons, mind you, who were already living that lifestyle. Many of them destroyed their first marriages by bringing in sister wives, and some of them lost everything as a result. Many children were brought into the world in dysfunctional marriages, and sure, there were a handful of families that were managing decently, but for the most part, it was a recipe for a total disaster. And far more important than any pragmatic concern, these men were unwittingly committing adultery, living in unrepentant adultery. Lord have mercy. That could have easily been me. It was only by God's grace that somehow I didn't continue down that road, because the Lord knows I would have not let anyone's opinions about me cause me to hesitate. I never cared what anyone thought about me if I was standing for what I believed to be right and true, and that would not have changed in this instance. Thus, when there is no real authority in a Christian paradigm by which the scriptures can be interpreted to set the standard of faith on any issue of faith and morals, people are left to their own fallen intellect and darkened nous to try to figure things out for themselves. As one can see, such can tragically result in self-deception that leads to the sinful destruction of souls, which made sense when I eventually read heresy referred to as soul-destroying heresy in the prayers of the Orthodox Church. Around this same time, I ended up losing my 10-year career. Technically, I lost it in the first week of January 2018, which also happened to be the last weekend that we attended our old church. Essentially, what happened in a nutshell was this. Back a couple years prior to this, in 2016, Kelly and I went out to dinner on what turned out to be the last night before our first child, Amelia Grace, was born. At the time, we still lived in our apartment that we initially moved into when we were dating. She moved back in once we were married. And this apartment was in a hipster part of town, and there was rainbow pride flags all over the place during and around the month of June. For whatever reason, I was feeling particularly annoyed at the fact that these flags were hanging off the light poles on the city property, so I snapped a quick picture of one and posted it on Facebook, essentially asking the question, like, what business does a municipality have embracing an exclusionary worldview like this? Well, when I woke up the next morning, that post was going mini viral, and there were dozens of shares, mostly from people I'd never met or even heard of, and mostly from people who were very upset and offended and angry that I dared to ask that question. Turns out, as I noticed when I read through the posts of the people who shared it, that the person who was responsible for getting those flags hung throughout the village actually somehow saw it and shared it himself. Needless to say, the vitriolic response was violent and merciless. I screenshotted everything at the time, and there were people threatening physical violence against me, people posting pictures of my wife and mocking her appearance, which is actually hilarious because she's objectively beautiful, so it just shows how petty they were being. And there were even threats to preemptively call CPS to get my daughter taken away after she was born. There were also threats to call my employer, who I sadly still had on my public profile at that time. Now, I was obviously very upset and sick when I saw all of this, so immediately I changed the privacy of the post to hide it from everyone as a form of damage control. Yet, I was still getting messages from random strangers, making all kinds of horrible accusations and judgments against me. I was dealing with all of this throughout the day as Kelly was in labor. I didn't tell her about any of it and tried my best to rest in the fact that I handled it as best I could, but I was genuinely concerned that people had called my employer. And when I eventually got back to work after the baby was born, my store manager, who I really respected and, we got along great, he sat me down and kind of awkwardly and it relayed that corporate had indeed fielded some calls about me. I immediately cut him off and pulled up the private post to show him what I actually said. I can only imagine what kind of horrific things were said about me by these people when they called. Thankfully, and by the grace of God, at that time, the company had my back completely. He assured me that I did nothing wrong and just advised me to take my employer off my page and consider changing my privacy settings. I was extremely relieved to hear this. Well, something about that experience being doxxed like that just definitely hit me hard. It really was surreal to simply pose a question and have hordes of literal, actual strangers respond by actively trying to destroy your life. Local Antifa also doxed me at that time, by the way. I had heard of such mob responses before, but when it happens to you personally, it makes it real in a way that it couldn't otherwise be understood. So I started writing a song about this experience and planning a music video. It took roughly a year and a half, but the song was called Progressive, and it was a scathing critique of radical leftism. All of the lyrics were tongue-in-cheek, and I played a leading officer of the Tolerance Police, complete with rainbow coexist uniforms, who sent anyone who disagreed with us about anything to the gallows. It was also a commentary on the Christian persecution that would almost certainly follow if such people ever had total power. Essentially, it was communicating how right beneath the facade of love and tolerance is really a grisly barbarism that would immediately surface under the right circumstances. The really big statement, however, was the intentional call-out of the Rainbow Mafia. After all, it was my pleasant experience with them that sparked the video's creation in the first place. So everyone that the Tolerance Police sent to the gallows in the video had their heads wrapped in a pride flag. The whole point being that they will complain and tell you not to shove your beliefs down their throat, even when you're not saying anything, but will kill you and wrap your corpse in their religious idol just to force their own beliefs down your throat one last time while they desecrate your body. That was the point. And really, I knew I was entering dangerous territory with that call out, but I just didn't care. As a Christian musician and videographer, I felt like it was my job to artistically tell the truth and sound the alarm about the dangers surrounding what we now call cancel culture and the kinds of people who were pioneering it. I fully knew that what I was doing was figuratively desecrating a pagan idol, and I was prepared to suffer the consequences, though I really didn't anticipate what would eventually play out to the extent that it did. Essentially, there was a homosexual female that worked in my department at that time, like a direct report of mine, and to make a long story short, I was informed, thankfully, by a very good friend who I worked with at the time, that on my day off after I released the music video, this girl had went to HR with my immediate supervisor and essentially claimed that I made a video about killing gay people, which obviously was patently absurd and just an outright lie. But I was told in subsequent meetings with the bigwigs from corporate that said individual felt targeted and unsafe as a result of my video, so they ended up terminating me on a workplace threats and violence violation, some obscure and generalized social media policy technicality. Yes, I was told that they knew that her interpretation of the video was obviously inaccurate, and it didn't matter because perception is reality. In retrospect, while I could be mistaken, I am quite certain that if I would have begged for mercy and told them I'd remove it from the internet immediately, I probably could have kept my job. But at that point, it was a matter of principle. There's no way on earth that I was taking that video down. I equated the thought of doing so with like the temptation to apologize for desecrating a pagan idol, like as a form of offering that pinch of incense. So thus it was 2 weeks before our second child, Joseph, was born. I found myself unemployed with absolutely no idea what I was going to do next and a lot of bills to pay. Now, the tragic irony of this whole ordeal is that the entire experience actually vindicated the message of the song entirely. Dare to publicly expose the hypocrisy of their secular religious cult, and they will come to destroy you. Thankfully, by God's grace, my wife and I never worried through the entire ordeal, and I say that honestly. Something deep down within us was actually acutely aware that we needed to just trust God to make a way for our family moving forward, and our faith really anchored us and gave us great peace throughout that difficult trial. It also turns out that this situation ended up being one of the greatest blessings in disguise that I could have never predicted. For the next 6 months, we survived off of side jobs and savings. My friend Tyler was renovating a house that he bought, and so were my uncle and cousins actually, all of whom graciously offered me the opportunity to work with them at an hourly rate, which I did. And once the weather broke, I was also landscaping 3 or 4 times a week. The work itself ended up also being a real blessing, as the piece of manual labor and working outside was a total shift from the high stress environment of management responsibilities that I previously held. And more importantly though, due to the significant reduction in the hours I was working on a weekly basis, I was afforded a tremendous opportunity to dig into my biblical studies in a way that I wouldn't have ever been able to prior to that, and certainly wouldn't be able to in the future. With that in mind, my wife and I actually decided to start a weekly Bible study at our home, which would prove, by God's grace, to be a fateful initiative that would in time result in our setting our feet upon the firm rock of Holy Orthodoxy. Our Bible study would have anywhere between 3 to 15 people coming on any given week, but there was a consistent core group of about 10 of us, all coming from multiple churches and various Christian backgrounds, mostly Protestant. We studied questions like what is hell, eternal conscious torment versus annihilationism. We studied the question of how the Mosaic Law applies to New Covenant believers, which was especially relevant as we had someone coming from a Hebrew roots background in the study. And I was struggling with some of those questions as well, particularly regarding the Sabbath and the dietary laws, actually. The overarching purpose of the study, though, was ultimately to find the church of the New Testament, whatever it was, and join ourselves to it. Like, we all just wanted to know the truth about the church. In pursuit of this goal, we spent a great deal of time studying the book of Acts. And the more we studied, the more apparent it became that most certainly there was a necessary aspect of human spiritual authority in the church. This was very disconcerting because I didn't know who comprised this authentic authority or where to find it. All I knew was that I wasn't under any, which necessarily meant that whatever the church was, I definitely wasn't in it. And the weight of the responsibility I bore to find the right answer to this question as a husband and father of two at that time really weighed heavily upon me. At one point, Kelly and I were very seriously considering joining the network of house churches that Francis Chan had established after seeing his basic video series. It resonated deeply with us at that point and seemed for a moment like maybe it was the answer we were searching for. Toward the end of this 4-month period that we hosted these studies, something happened that ended up being a turning point in our journey. My friend Keaton, who was a fiery and truth-loving fundamentalist, if you will, like myself, reappeared on Facebook after a months-long hiatus. Except when he returned, he had a strange 3-barred cross overlaid on his profile picture. I noticed in the comments that this was an Orthodox cross. After a cursory Google search, all I concluded was that this was some sort of weird form of Roman Catholicism. But I always respected Keaton greatly, and I knew without a doubt that he wouldn't embrace an entire belief system if there wasn't a good reason for it. So I reached out to him and told him that I was concerned for him, but I wanted to understand what I was missing. For the next several weeks, we would be in regular communication, and he spent several hours on the phone on multiple phone calls introducing me to the Orthodox Church and the basics of church history. I was definitely not always the most open-minded, and I was always trying to steer the conversation toward my pet theological subjects, but he showed me tremendous patience and love, and even when I would get obstinately defensive. Thus, thanks to this beloved internet friend who cared for my soul enough to engage me and share the truth, I was set on my course of discovering the ancient faith. Love you, bro. Eventually, our excitement that was present when we began this Bible study in some ways really turned to exhaustion. We had been using a Greek lexicon to see what certain words originally meant in the scriptures to try and understand them better. This issue left us with more questions than answers as to what the scriptures were even teaching. On other subjects, there could be 2 or 3 different theological perspectives that could logically make sense, even mutually exclusive ones. The most important question, how can we ever know for sure what is true, began to really gnaw at our collective consciences. None of us wanted to abandon the idea that confidence and certainty regarding the Christian faith was attainable, but experientially we were realizing that if there is no authority to bind our consciences to any one understanding about anything pertaining to the faith, that really we are just left to lean on our own fallible understanding. And that was extremely depressing because everyone in that study was keenly aware of how many times we'd changed our minds on different matters of faith in the past. We were also keenly aware of how confused we still were on certain issues, like something wasn't adding up at all. Are we really just left with our best guesses? Is this what Christ left us through his apostles? That each one of us on an individual basis in every successive generation was tasked with studying the scriptures and figuring out the faith from scratch? This was an impossible burden. Impossible not for lack of effort or desire, but rather it made absolutely no sense, and there was no way to confirm if your beliefs are true. What seemed to make sense today could seem to be wrong tomorrow. The only way for that not to be the case would be to close our mind to new information. So the only way for our personal standard of faith to be guaranteed as consistent was to become willfully ignorant for the rest of our lives to any new information or perspective. Like, this was crazy. This had to be wrong. There can only be one Christian faith. There had to be a way to know what that is, for sure. Or else really this entire religion is honestly absurd. But We knew why we believed in Christ. We just had to figure out what we were missing. The scriptures spoke of the faith as a deposit once delivered to the saints. Did everyone just lose that deposit? Were Christians in the first and second and third centuries all as confused as I was? Did they understand what the church was? The fundamentals of the faith? Did they know if we were allowed to eat pork or had to keep the Sabbath? Did they know whether or not marriage was monogamy only? Or did they know what baptism was in its purpose, form, and function? Further, as someone who took evangelism very seriously, how do you evangelize anyone to a faith that is ever subject to change as often as you change your own opinion? How do you expect someone to convert and commit their entire lives to a belief system that is comprised purely of somebody else's best guesses about what the religion actually teaches? This entire epistemic framework, when applied, really ends up making just an outright mockery of Christianity. Everyone's literally just guessing in a belief system where their guesses literally become the foundation of their personal theology. It's madness. Even worse, we started looking into the book of Enoch and other apocryphal works and wondered, how do we even know for sure that these books weren't scripture? Why are we trusting the historic church, who we believe to be apostates, to tell us what books were authentic and inspired? None of this made an ounce of sense. The futility of our perpetually spinning wheels was beginning to wear us down mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. One of our last Bible studies, it was just me, my wife, Kelly, and our close friend Ryan from our old church. Keaton had just introduced me to the Apostolic Fathers and told me about the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. To be frank, it absolutely blew my mind. I mean, I had no idea that there were all these writings from bishops in the first century, contemporaries with the apostles. Like, the thought of being able to get a glimpse into this window of the early church was extremely exciting to me. So we decided that night to read through some of his epistles. The experience was absolutely invigorating. Ryan and I were genuinely amazed at what we were reading, like overjoyed. It was all right there in black and white. St. Ignatius's descriptions of the church in its hierarchy and structure were explicit and undeniable. The same threefold offices of the church mentioned in Greek, which we learned from our Bible study, were all there, differentiated right in his epistles. The bishops, the presbyters, and the deacons. The centrality of the Eucharist as a manifestation of Christian unity. It was almost unbelievable. This is the church we were searching for. We realized in that moment that we had been misreading the book of Acts and looking at it as some kind of like detailed prescription for what the church ought to look like for the rest of time. In reality, it was merely a historical account of how the church began. It was never meant to be a detailed, permanent prescription. If we wanted to know what the early church looked and functioned like, all we really had to do was zoom out a single generation and read the writings that we were now immersing ourselves in. This was the answer all along. How obvious. How beautiful. We were rejoicing together to have found such a precious treasure as these writings. And at one point, I turned excitedly to Kelly to share with her another reference to the Eucharist that we had just encountered. And I noticed that something wasn't right with her. She seemed upset and, without replying, just started to cry. I was taken aback, honestly, and I had no idea what the problem could have been. This was a joyous occasion, a reason to celebrate. But in that moment, it really did finally hit me that, like, my wife is not wired the same way that I am. In my mind, I was more than willing to instantly shed all of my previous beliefs and align them with this newfound information. For Kelly, all she could hear is that basically everything we thought we believed and based our lives upon over the last several years was just wrong. In my mind and heart, I was already eagerly transitioning to the next phase of my journey and exploring Orthodox Christianity, yet she had barely even begun to process what we were just explaining to her. As she shared her frustrations through tears, Ryan quickly and quietly began to pack up and leave us to talk alone. I was able to bring her comfort and explain to her why I was so overjoyed, that these writings were pointing us to the pillar and foundation of Christian truth, the church that we had been diligently and desperately searching for. I also explained to her what I have explained to many inquirers since then. And though she didn't fully understand in that moment, she trusted me and was willing to open herself up to continuing our journey together wherever I led our family. Great woman, I tell you. But she always wanted to understand for herself. So our days were filled with constant discussions as I continued to bring to her the new information that I was absorbing. It was obviously critical for both of us that, we made sure we were on the same page with each step that we took. I believe it was the following week after that Bible study that Ryan first visited Saints Peter and Paul, a local Orthodox church in Buffalo, New York. After he kind of scoped things out, Kelly and I brought Amelia, Grace, and Joseph to Vespers the week following. We had absolutely no idea what to expect, but I was overtaken by the serene and warm beauty of the church lit by candlelight. There was hardly anyone there. I believe the priest, Father Vlad, and his wife, Matushka Jeannie, who we would meet after the service, and perhaps one or two others. I had absolutely no idea what was going on, but I instantly knew somehow that this was what my soul was longing for so many years. I believe we ended up attending the Divine Liturgy for the first time the very next morning, and yet again I was overtaken by how beautiful, prayerful, and mechanical everything was. I was also elated to find out that all of the music in the Orthodox Church was sung a cappella. Come on. Coming from an a cappella background in college, I had an immediate love and appreciation for this kind of choral music and imagined myself participating one day. The hymns were just so beautiful, such a heavenly blend of joy, peace, and reverence. We ended up faithfully attending that parish for the next 6 months, attending every service we could, even through Great Lent, merely as inquirers, not even yet formal catechumens. The more I attended, the more I longed to embrace the church and actually become Orthodox. Although I was perfectly clear with everyone there that we were still studying and not yet committed, they all treated us as family and welcomed us with open arms, and we embraced them as family in return. At this point, our journey had hit the next and final crossroads, as I was very busy taking a fresh and unbiased look at the claims of the Roman Catholic Church over against the claims of Orthodoxy.
I'm going.
Father Vlad was the priest who ultimately received us into the faith. Kelly and I were so incredibly blessed to have been gifted him and his wife as the beautiful people to usher us into the church. He was so encouraging and patient with me as I barraged him with questions for months on end. Both he and Matushka Jeannie showed our family so much sincere love and care, and they related to us deeply. There was also an old Facebook friend I had since my Ron Paul days who reached out to me once she saw me posting about Orthodoxy. I never realized she was an Orthodox Christian, and I came to find out that her husband was actually an Orthodox priest. Father Photius and Matushka Samantha ended up being a tremendous and unexpected blessing to our family. Soon after we started talking, a number of books arrived at our front doorstep, as well as our first icons too. Father Photius spent much time answering so many of my questions about church history and helping me understand Orthodox theology. In truth, I was being catechized really by two priests at once, each one with his own unique strengths and wisdom to impart upon me. How much grace God bestowed upon us. By September of 2018, my soul was desperately longing to become Orthodox, but my rational senses couldn't allow myself to commit until I had a firm understanding of why I would reject Roman Catholicism. The last thing I wanted to do was commit to Orthodoxy and then 6 months down the road hear a great apologetic argument for Roman Catholicism and have to uproot my entire family again. Now, my reasons for ultimately choosing Orthodoxy over Roman Catholicism will have to be addressed in a separate video, Lord willing. I've already got 6 or 7 pages written in preparation for that video, but I've got a lot more work to do. So, for anyone who might be tempted to use anything I say in this video as if it's like some substantive argument or apologetic presentation for why I became Orthodox over Roman Catholic, just take a chill pill, be patient. I'll give you that material, Lord willing, to address at some point, but this is not it. Just wanted to make that perfectly abundantly clear. So I was immersing myself in the arguments about the papacy, and I got to a point towards the end of those 6 months where I would come up to Father Vlad after one of the services or something, and I'd have some obscure question of history for him or whatever, and he would just kind of like grab my shoulders and be like, Paul, just keep praying and God will confirm for you where you're supposed to be. And he wasn't copping out at that point. It's just really was like, I was exhausting the subject matter. Unless I was going to go be a scholar and spend my life devoted to studying these historic matters, like there's a point where you have to allow God to lead you. You can't just rely on your own rational faculties because they're limited and flawed. And if I had one issue that I would take with Roman Catholic apologetics, it's that they almost overcorrected in response to the Protestant hyper-emotionalism and kind of like devalue the role that your experience plays in confirming the truth for you. Like, it's not just our experiences, because our experiences are subjective and it's hard to discern what's from God and what's not, etc. But it can't also just be our fallen reason, right? For the same reasons. We could be wrong. We could be understanding things incorrectly. Like, it has to be a blend of both of those things. And that was a very big struggle for me as someone who wants to perfectly understand everything. It was humbling to really dive into a subject hardcore and not be able to figure out from the history, like find that silver bullet argument that just takes care of one of the paradigms, you know? And in reality, the papacy has had upwards of 1,000 years to essentially get their story straight. You know, they're not dumb. They've figured out a very airtight way to make their paradigm almost in a way not falsifiable. They present it in a way that's falsifiable, but it's really not, because the criteria to judge whether or not it's been falsified is not within your realm of discernment. At some point, you have to allow God to experientially guide you. You can't entirely rely on your own fallen reasoning to evaluate these questions of history or theology and make a decision purely based on that. I devoured book after book on the division, the history, the theology, the current state of each ecclesial body. Most of these amazing books were recommended to me by Jay Dyer, someone whose work on this subject played a critical role in helping me discern the truth of these matters. I spent many hours listening to his presentations, several of which I still refer back to at times because of how well he articulated the subject matter. So, it came to pass one night that Archbishop Michael of the OCA, Diocese of New York and New Jersey, came to visit our parish, and it was a evening Vespers service, beautiful, and after Vespers, we ended up going to the hall just for, food and just to hang out, essentially. I actually had one of my Roman Catholic friends I'd been dialoguing with visit our church that night, and he came to hang out with his friend as well. And Archbishop Michael sat with our group. My sister, I believe, was there for a time, if I'm recalling correctly, and there were several other younger people there and inquirers, and we were all at this table, and Archbishop Michael just graciously gave us so much of his time. I mean, hours of his time into the late hours, if not early morning, and he just talked with us and answered our questions and was so sincere and caring and loving and zealous. He was zealous because when my friend challenged him on the filioque, my friend's a smart guy, but he was a little bit maybe aggressive in how he was stating his position. And Archbishop Michael did not put up with it for a second. He didn't respond in kind, but he was very firm, very zealous, and very clear about the church's position on the filioque. articulating the theological issues with it as well, not just the problem of its insertion into the creed. So that really left a major mark on me. My jaw was just like, I mean, it was actually closed, but in my head, my jaw was open the whole time, just like, I'm sitting at a table with this archbishop answering any remaining question I have and like showing me in real life what a real bishop in the church is. Like, this church I've been searching for this whole time, it just was made so real to me right before my eyes to see this successor of the apostles sitting right across from me and ministering to us in this way. So selflessly, so authentically. This just struck me as like, this is a real bishop. This is what a Christian bishop would be if I imagined it. And after everyone kind of packed up and left that night, it must have been midnight at this time, if not a little bit later, Father Vlad and Archbishop Michael and a couple of other clergy who were left went back into the church to do some kind of evening, I don't know, prayer service. I don't even know what they did, to be honest with you. And they thought I left, but I was just kind of moseying around the side of the church because it was a gorgeous night out. There was a light breeze and it was summer. And I was just enjoying that moment of peace. And I heard them start singing coming out of the windows of the church. So I walked back up to the back stoop that would lead into like where the altar servers get changed back there. And the doors were open of the church. So like, the door was open to ultimately the altar, so I could hear them very clear. And I just sat on that stoop, looking up at the trees, blowing in the breeze above me on this absolutely perfect night, listening to these Orthodox clergymen chant these beautiful hymns. And I said in my heart, I was like, this is what I've been searching for. Like, I'm in heaven right now. I had that moment. I'm not even trying to be over dramatic. It's like the moment that they talk about with Prince Vladimir's emissaries who say when they went to Hagia Sophia and they say, you know, we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth when we heard the worship. That's how I felt at that moment. And I was just processing that experience with Archbishop Michael at the table and all of the things I'd studied and how much my soul was yearning for orthodoxy and how confident I was in the Orthodox arguments over against Roman Catholicism, despite not having the silver bullet that my rational mind wanted to have before I made the commitment. And I decided right then and there that I was becoming Orthodox. It was that night, that very moment. And I had such a peace. I cannot describe to you the peace that I had. It was like surreal. This is what I'd been searching for so many years. It was like the culmination of this decade-long search, you know. Thus, it progressed that we were received shortly thereafter, officially in October of 2018, myself, my wife, and my 2 children. And that, honestly, was probably the best day of my life, if I had to rank them. What could be more glorious than that? Being received into the true Church of Christ with my wife and my 2 children beside me, all together at once. It was just... like, glory to God. God is so good. If I died tomorrow, I've already been given so much. So much. I deserve nothing, and I've been given so much joy and blessings. That was the best day of my life. In January 2019, I became choir director at Saints Peter and Paul, which was a tremendous honor and joy. It was like living the fulfillment of my a cappella career. It's like this is why I was in an a cappella group, to prepare me for leading a choir at an Orthodox church. I enjoyed every minute of that. In June of 2019, I was tonsured and ordained a reader, which is just minor clergy in the Orthodox Church, with my close friend and brother, Ryan, right beside me on the very same day. I failed to mention also that Of that core group of about 9 or 10 people, 6 of them are now Orthodox. And 2 of them who met at my house for that Bible study are now married and Orthodox. So, yeah, unbelievable, the web God was providentially weaving for all of us. And now, at this point, I've got 6 beautiful, precious children that God's blessed me with, and my wife, who is also pregnant with our 7th at this very time. We are overjoyed to be members now of a ROCOR parish here in Western New York, a very explosively growing ROCOR parish, I might add, with an amazing spiritual father who is really caring for our souls in a way that we desperately need. And I've got so many friends from our old Protestant circles and even others who are Roman Catholics inquiring into Orthodoxy and becoming Orthodox. And my heart is so full to be witnessing this beautiful transformation in their lives. That kind of sums up my story. That's the long and the short of it, the long of it. Thanks for sticking around this whole time. If you made it, you now know like pretty much everything that matters about me. I guess I'll just leave you with some of these closing thoughts that will give you a little bit more of a clearer picture as to what motivates me and what this channel is ultimately all about and will continue to be centered around. So I am unapologetically zealous for true Christian unity. Not only would it provide us with our greatest chance to truly impact the culture with effectual change for the sake of our children, but more importantly, this is our Lord's great desire, and salvation ultimately hangs in the balance. With that said, the only way we will ever achieve true, authentic Christian unity in any meaningful, discernible sense is for everyone to turn around, walk back toward the trunk of the tree of division to a time when everyone was united in faith, and believe that faith and enjoin ourselves to that church. There must be a widespread return to the ancient and holy Orthodox faith. Today, Christ's scattered sheep are being called to humbly and joyously embrace the church that he established through his apostles, the church which never apostatized. We must return to the faith of the early church before all the divisions. These divisions can only result in further and infinite fracturing due to the faulty theological and epistemic paradigm that precludes the authentic church's existence. I consider myself blessed to have been born in a time and in a country where the true faith is just beginning to take root in many ways, where the population is largely unaware of its existence. It is no coincidence to me that the internet is available at this age to facilitate the illumination of Christians to the history of their faith. It is also no coincidence to me that many are becoming disillusioned with the false dichotomy in the West that they've been offered and are aware of: Roman Catholicism versus some form of Protestantism. I firmly believe that genuine ignorance of orthodoxy is the primary enabler that allows most sincere, Christ-loving people to remain committed to their heterodoxy. So many people just need one single person in their life who cares about them to reach out in sincere love and charity and share their Orthodox faith and illumine them to the realities of our faith and history. Sure, some will choose to reject it out of pride, fear, laziness, or indifference. In such cases, people reveal that their ultimate desire is not actually Christ or the truth, but rather their own worldly cares or desires, or perhaps even a false Christianity that they've become comfortable with and prefer over the truth. All we can do is love on and pray for such people. And God forgive us if we don't make those efforts. But so many just need one person to show them. That's why I'm doing this. And Lord willing, there will be much more to come. And now I'd like to end this kind of with a word of encouragement to all of those who are watching, and especially those who are inquiring into Orthodoxy from a different Christian tradition or background, and for whom encountering the Orthodox faith has been more of an experience primarily of suffering or trauma than it has been joy and excitement for various reasons. What you're going through, if that's you, know that it's incredibly normal. That doesn't make it any easier or less painful, but it's extremely common. You don't have to feel like you're the only one going through this crazy journey or as if nobody can relate to you. So many people go through this period of personal chaos where they are alternating between excitement, encouragement, distress, sadness, melancholy, or even despair from what many are referring to these days as ecclesial anxiety. It is a real whirlwind. I remember it to a degree, though I was much more open to it as I was prepared for it experientially in a way that many others aren't when they first encounter this information. I had already experienced why Protestant anti-church epistemology was wrong. So when I had the intellectual and historical arguments presented to me, I was like, oh, yeah, like that right there. That perfectly explains the hopeless futility of my experience the last 4 years in Protestantism as a truth seeker. But if you haven't personally experienced the problems before you hear the intellectual reasons as to why they are problems, it's much more difficult. Just know this. You don't have to make a commitment on anything in your mind or your heart right this second. To have this ecclesial anxiety is normal and even healthy in a way because you're confronting and dealing with the claim that there is only one church. So it's reasonable that you'd have a degree of anxiety as to where or what that church is because you want to be in it. Let's keep it positive. That means you care. Don't give in to that anxiety. The caring is the healthy part, not the anxiety itself. You should turn that feeling into a motivating factor, into an encouragement. See it as a blessing that God is illuminating you and taking you on this journey at all, because you care about pursuing the truth and because He loves you as an individual. On that note, here's one extremely important point. In order for a Christian worldview to even be tenable, it must posit some sort of authoritative epistemic mechanism by which the canon of Scripture can be rationally accounted for, and by which the true interpretations of those Scriptures relative to fundamental dogma can be rendered intelligible. And not just on an individual basis, but to all the faithful throughout the ages, and in a way that they can actually be meaningfully held accountable to. Without such an epistemic mechanism, all scriptural interpretations become purely subjective, and the Christian faith is reduced ultimately to inescapable and self-refuting theological relativism. If your Christian worldview doesn't even posit such an authoritative epistemic mechanism, it is false from the outset. Rewind that last 20 seconds or whatever and watch that as many times as you need to if you're a Protestant. I'm telling you, if you can understand that, there's no turning back. I'm dead serious. If there's one thing you can do as you continue on this path that will help keep you from such despair, it will be to keep your eyes fixed on Christ as you continue to study. Just like St. Peter when he's walking on the water, being called out of the ship. He's doing great at first, then all the waves and the wind and the lightning and everything else distracted him. So he became terrified and began to sink in despair. But then he looked on Christ, who then grabbed him and pulled him back up. Likewise, we have to affix our eyes on Christ at this critical juncture in our lives and wholly trust Him, that He will see us through if we are faithful to resolve to find the true Christian faith, the truth of Christ Himself in His visible body, the church. Just trust him. What is one pragmatic way that we can accomplish this? Well, for starters, one huge thing you can do is just resign yourself not to cling to something if it doesn't make sense. It seems simple, right? You'd be surprised. It's okay to not be convinced of the Orthodox position yet. But the unhealthy thing is when we turn back to something that we repeatedly are recognizing and being shown does not make any sense. If you can just objectively evaluate your current theological paradigm and understand at each juncture why it doesn't work, then at the bare minimum in your conscience, you can be free to move forward without feeling tethered to something that is literally wrong. So the most important thing you can focus on is resolving that issue in your mind first. Is my current Baptist paradigm tenable? Forget about the questions like, well, what happens to Christians who die outside of the Orthodox Church? Or, this feels unfair that I have to find the right one. How am I expected to do this? I'm a mother or a father. I've got kids. This is stressful. I'm not a scholar or a historian or a theologian. Forget about all that stuff for a second and just evaluate the question. Given what I am learning about church history and about what the church is and was considered to be by everyone prior to the Protestant Reformation in its most fundamental aspects, does my Protestant church meet that basic criteria for reconciling with ancient ecclesiology? Because remember, even for the Oriental churches, the only significant and lasting schism of the first millennium, even they maintained the same basic ecclesiology comprised of the threefold offices of the church and the necessary principle of apostolic succession through the laying on of hands in the bishopric. The same fundamental understanding of schism and unity. These things were literally a given prior to the Reformation. So start there. If the answer about your church is no, it doesn't meet that basic criteria to reconcile with ancient ecclesiology, then you don't have to lose sleep over the other doctrines you used to believe in anymore. You can let them go because your church is false. Of course, you can look at all these things, and it can help to do the deep dives on historical doctrinal comparisons, but the church has to be the fundamental starting point. Resolve that question in your mind, and it will lift such a massive weight off of your shoulders. Find the right church, find the right theology. It's almost like a shortcut to the truth. Also, let me make this very clear. You should be extremely cautious not to pressure yourself to make any decisions out of fear. There is a healthy kind of fear that drives us and motivates our desire to be in the truth. But you would never convert to orthodoxy based out of fear, ever. In fact, orthodoxy is radically different than, say, an evangelical paradigm where altar calls are the norm. These are the churches stirring up people's emotions with worship songs and hitting you with a 3-minute gospel sales pitch and bingo, you're ready to be baptized now, and congratulations, you're one of us. This kind of decision is often made in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, in these scenarios. Raise your hand and 30 seconds later, you're in the water. God forgive me, but that is insane. It is completely opposed by the reality of history. Catechesis, or a period of time that is spent preparing for holy baptism and reception into the church, is as old as the apostles. The Didache is itself an apostolic catechism, and that's a first century document. So we never encourage decisions based on some carnal fear or spontaneous desire. You need to be able to trust in God's mercy during this period of inquiry. You cannot panic or think you need to rush. In fact, becoming Orthodox is systematically not a rushed process. In total contrast to the evangelical spur-of-the-moment conversions at an altar call, there are really 3 phases to becoming Orthodox. And I don't mean to generalize all of Protestantism in that way. I'm just using that as an example. First, you have the inquirer phase, which is an informal period of time where you're just asking questions or studying and researching, perhaps attending, even faithfully, an Orthodox church. Walking into an Orthodox church and attending entails zero commitment. You could attend 50 times in a row or even for several years straight, and that would entail zero commitment. The only time any degree of commitment begins is when you finally decide to become Orthodox and are formally made a catechumen, which involves a priest and an actual prayer service. After that point, yes, it is more serious to turn back because you've now begun the formal process of preparing for baptism, and you get special prayers of the church as a catechumen, etc. But even then, the catechumenate period can last anywhere from a couple months to a few years, depending on the individual and their stumbling blocks or struggles and background, as well as the priest's discernment regarding their degree of spiritual sobriety and preparation. So there's absolutely nothing you can do to possibly rush becoming Orthodox. All you can really do is just stress yourself out. Becoming an Orthodox Christian is the most serious decision you will ever make in your life. To become Orthodox and then apostatize is worse than never being converted at all, because now you're essentially Judas. So it's incredibly serious and is dealt with by the church in a serious manner, and there is no rushing it, save perhaps for nearness of death or human error. So continue at whatever pace you can without literally despairing. But on the flip side, don't let that temptation to despair prevent you from digging in. Just find the balance. It's all about being grounded in Christ's mercy. Because if you're grounded in Christ's mercy, you can zealously pursue the truth to the maximum degree that you're able, and it will benefit you. But if you're not grounded in Christ's mercy, watching even a single YouTube video once a month might be too much for you, because it will bring you back to the fear and the anxiety, which is all demonic. You have to trust that God is doing a work in you. Ask the right questions. What will happen to those who die outside the Orthodox faith? What can I have wrong and still be saved? These are the wrong questions. The right questions are, what is the true faith? Am I believing it? What is the true church? Am I in it? And of course, the most important question of all, how can I know? I've experienced the consequences of error very deeply in my own life. The whole reason I engage people is to help them find the truth that brings the peace that surpasses all understanding. Real, authentic truth seekers in the Protestant paradigm will spin their wheels until they burn out. And for many, that burnout ends in apostasy. I hate to see such a tragic and unnecessary end for people who have never even tasted of true Christianity. This entire journey is largely about being willing and able to put all of your theological presumptions and presuppositions and ideas that you are comfortable with and intellectually tethered to on the chopping block. You're not tearing up the foundation, so don't think of it that way. The foundation is Christ. So if you already know why you believe in Christ, then don't think of it as ripping up your foundation. Yes, you may have to tear down a few floors. You may even have to raise the entire building right down to the cornerstone. Once we complete this necessary work of humility, then and only then can we begin to rebuild the edifice of our faith, but this time on the principles of Orthodox Christian truth. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, O Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy upon us and save us. Amen.
For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. For you are good and love and kind. Wash me thoroughly from my lawlessness and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my lawlessness. Savior, save me.